Welcome. I'm John Carlin, the chair of Aspen Digital's Cybersecurity Program, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the second day of our annual Cyber Summit. I want to thank FireEye, Intel, and Proofpoint for making this week's summit possible and helping us convene such an important set of conversations in really an unprecedented year. I'd also like to acknowledge Blue Vector, SICPA-NA, and the American Gas Association for their additional support. We've never been more reliant on digital technology than we have this year, highlighting the importance of conversations like these as we try to make sense of particularly crazy and unsettling times. And we're grateful to FireEye, Intel, Proofpoint, Blue Vector, SICPA-NA, and the American Gas Association for understanding how important these convenings can be. The full summit agenda and bios of all our speakers are available at aspencybersummit.org. We've got a great day ahead of us today, including conversations about disinformation, space threats, and the challenges of securing emerging technologies, an issue we've seen in the headlines concerning companies from Huawei to TikTok. At the end of the day, we'll have a special session with two national security leaders, my successor at the Justice Department, Assistant Attorney General for National Security, John Demers, and the first ever Senate-confirmed director of the National Counterintelligence and Security Center, Bill Evanina. They're going to discuss the threat and challenges posed by China, and should be a fascinating conversation. The Aspen Cybersecurity Group today is also releasing, as part of our summit, a national cyber agenda for the Biden administration and the 117th Congress to help build a more secure foundation for the internet and our digital economy. You can check out the full report at aspencybersummit.org, and we'll talk about details of it for the first time tomorrow during the summit. Now I'm pleased to introduce Pete Williams from NBC News in conversation with the director of the U.S. Secret Service, Jim Murray, to talk about the threat from transnational organized crime. We're grateful to Director Murray for returning to the Aspen Cyber Summit. He first addressed us as one of his first addresses in his new job as director of the Secret Service. Welcome.
Thanks very much, John, and hello to everybody. And Mr. Murray, thank you very much for your time here today. So let's just jump right into it. Cybercrime is such a growth area. How do you decide what your law enforcement agency is going to specialize in? When there's a bigger cybercrime, is it just a jump ball, or how do you know when it's your turn in the barrel?
Great question. Absolutely. So I think most people, maybe not the folks joining the conversation today, are probably most familiar with the Secret Service because of our protective mission. But that's not how we started out. Our origin story goes back to 1865. And legend has it that one of the last official acts of President Lincoln was to authorize the creation of the Secret Service. And what he was trying to do was to address a threat that was prevalent at the time. And it wasn't a threat against our national leaders. It was a threat against our economy, specifically a threat that involved counterfeit currency or bogus notes. So we were created to combat that threat, and our mandate then was to protect the country's financial infrastructure and our payment systems and so forth. For about 40 years, we were nothing but an investigative agency. It wouldn't be until after the McKinley assassination that we picked up protection as well. And for about 120 years now, we've had this dual or integrated mission of protection and investigation that we feel is symbiotic, and one really enhances the other. Heavy on counterfeit throughout the 20th century. In the 70s and 80s, we started getting involved with fraud, namely access device or credit card fraud, bank fraud. In the 80s, we got involved in this thing called computer crimes, and we sort of built on it from there. We started some task forces in the 90s. So today, we're in lockstep with our partners at DOJ, FBI, Homeland Security Investigations in this fight against cybercrime. But Pete, the reality is our mandate today in 2020 is the same as it was in 1865. Protect our country's national financial infrastructure.
But how do you decide what cyber crimes you're going to concentrate on? Does, for example, the fact that you have this protective mission make you a little more aware of detecting threats online in advance? I mean, what is in your lane in terms of cybercrime?
Sure. So both on the investigative side of the house and protective side of the house, we are very much focused on preventing a bad day. And then if that bad day occurs, what are we going to do, right? There's really no such thing as elimination of risk. It's about mitigation of risk. And that's true when it comes to threats on the protective side of the house. It's also true when it comes to cyber threats. Our focus and we sort of stay in a lane that is supporting various sectors like the financial sector. Whereas if something's state sponsored, we're going to work with our partners at agencies like the FBI to say, hey, this appears to be a state sponsored type activity and farm it over to them. But the reality is things are very different nowadays than they were 10, 15 years ago. It is very much an ensemble cast. So same thing works with the FBI. If they come across something that's organically, a financial sector violation, they're likely to come to us and say, hey, what are you guys seeing?
Well, the COVID epidemic, of course, has produced all kinds of fraud. What kind of cyber crimes are you seeing as a result of that?
We are seeing quite an uptick in activity, and certainly a lot of tailoring of schemes that are already out there. The one thing that we were ready for, in addition to making sure that we kept our workforce safe and we were fit on the protective side of the house, was we have learned some lessons from prior instances where there have been disasters and there's been outreach by the federal government to provide assistance. And what we know is that when there's stimulus packages that are offered, that's great for our citizenry, but there's also a whole sub-society of people that look to exploit those opportunities and commit fraud. I'll give you an example. In or about 2011, I was the agent in charge of the the Secret Service's Atlantic City office. And in that year, we opened up 2 Hurricane Katrina fraud cases. That's 6 years after Hurricane Katrina in the state of New Jersey. So we knew as this thing started revving up and rolling out in the spring that we were going to be in this for the long haul. And prime amongst the lessons we've learned is that we had to get the word out and we had to work to disrupt rather than build, fantastic cases on the outset. So early in March, we put out a lot of alerts and communications to our partners and the people in the various sectors, primarily about phishing. I think we all know what phishing is. And if we don't, we just have to go to our junk email box on our Yahoo or our Gmail accounts, and you can find rudimentary examples of phishing, but some of them are really targeted. And that certainly was the case at the advent of COVID. Beyond that, we wanted to make sure that as, both private and public sectors sort of reverted to a remote operation, that they were mindful of the cyber vulnerabilities that may present themselves by default. In other words, if you had a system whereby things like wire transfers had an in-person oversight mechanism in an office, and you've lost that now is a vulnerability, and you want to cover down on that gap. As far as the criminal activities themselves, Pete, they are plentiful. We started to see early on fraud schemes involving non-delivery of PPE. One of the first cases we had was a $300 million case out of Georgia where an individual was claiming to be the middleman to provide PPE, and we were able to identify that and knock that one down. We also saw a lot, and we still do see a lot with fake testing sites where there's online availability providing either kits or opportunities to get tested when they don't really exist. Obviously, these fraudsters are exploiting hope and fear, and people are eager to get tested. If anybody's trying to get tested privately, you might sit online for 8 hours or more and then have to go home. So if you see an opportunity online to do it, obviously that's appealing. That's a double shot for the fraudsters. What they're doing is they're getting you to agree to pay for that test that doesn't exist. And they're also getting your sensitive, personal, identifiable information to further re-victimize you in the future.
Well, you talked about effect on the economy as one of the original reasons the Secret Service existed. So what's been the effect on the U.S. economy of this COVID fraud?
So the CARES Act, we're somewhere in the area of $3 trillion that's been allocated or rolled out to support our citizens. I can tell you, working fraud back in the 90s, there was an old rule of thumb, don't know if it was true, but your banks and your credit cards were willing to write off somewhere in the area of 4% against fraud. They were willing to take that 4% loss. Let's just bring that down to 1%. With a $3 trillion outlay of taxpayers' money, if there's a 1% fraud loss, you're talking about $30 billion in loss to the American taxpayer. Now I know there's conversations ongoing on the Hill where we might add another $1 trillion. So that's why it was so important for us to get out ahead of this thing and disrupt. And to use a sports analogy, as I said earlier, we weren't worrying about initially, building just fantastic cases. We wanted to get out there and be in a full court press and deny, and force these fraudsters to make a mistake and put the ball on the floor and lose their dribble, and we trap them and they turn the ball over. That's where we were coming from the outset.
As long as we're talking about COVID, I have to ask you, what has been the effect of the pandemic on the men and women of the Secret Service, beyond just cyber, just day-to-day mission?
So very proud of the resilience and the flexibility our folks have served. Obviously, in this, I know you know this from your line of work, but there's three types of employees, if you will, in the Secret Service. There's we're about 7,700 strong. About a third of those are mission support folks, and those job series run the gamut. About another 1,600 or so are our uniform division police officers. If you've seen on TV or in around the White House, they do physical security there, but they also run a lot of our specialized units. And then the remainder, about 3,600 or so, are special agents. The one thing we realized right away, I remember vividly being on a call back around January 31st. On that day, there was an agency-involved shooting down in Florida. I had my family up on a college tour, if you will, up in New England, and I had a conference call at a certain time in the evening. And then at the same time, DHS, for whom we work, had a conference call about this thing called coronavirus, which we'd heard a little bit about, but we weren't sure if it was even transmittable human to human. And that's when I first heard the word zootropic. And so I get on these two conference calls, and a family member has a picture of me in Mystic Pizza, Mystic, Connecticut, on two different phones. Suffice it to say that the conference call about the shooting lasted only about a half an hour, but I was on that COVID call for probably 2+ hours. And candidly, what I knew at the end of that call was that I didn't know what was coming at us, and went back and talked to Secret Service leadership. And we discussed, hey, again, we can't really eliminate a risk if you can't define it, but what can we do to mitigate it? So the one thing we knew we didn't have the capability of was to have our workforce work remotely. There'd been a reticence in the Secret Service, of being honest, to do telework. So we invested a lot of money in ensuring we had the bandwidth to do that. Again, not realizing that's that path we'd be on. Call it a lucky guess, and that's I'll take it. I'm not much of a lucky guesser, but that one worked out for us. Likewise, we wanted to take inventory of the PPE we had on stock, and then go ahead and procure the rest. And then as far as staffing, obviously that's great for all the folks that can go home, work from home, but a good portion of our workforce is forward facing. They are external, they're operational, they have to be out there and hold the post. They do have to travel and support protective operations. So we went to a sort of a port and starboard approach, where we had a platooning situation where one group was going to go out and work a certain event. They would do it for a certain amount of time, and then they would be sidelined, if you will, and then we'd bring another one out. Admittedly, that port and starboard turned into more of like a Major League Baseball 5-day pitcher rotation, where you had to have people roll through. But we were pretty robust in our, very mindful of not just CDC guidelines. We've had a long-standing relationship with Johns Hopkins and strong, partnership with them, the White House Medical Unit, NIH, Walter Reed, and so on. We started testing back in the spring, and if anything, I think we could probably be accused of being overzealous in terms of, if somebody's a secondary contact, we were inclined to kind of have them take a breather and sit out a few plays as well when the CDC might not call for that.
So let's go back to cyber now. Tell us, you spoke to this conference a year ago. How have you seen the cyber threat evolve since then? And let me ask you about one specific aspect of it that seems to be a real growth area, and that's ransomware attacks. Yeah,
so love to be able to tell you that we've seen a significant downtick in cyber activity. We haven't. I think that's not necessarily indicative that there's a huge uptick. I think that because of the partnerships between the various federal agencies, state agencies, and the private sector, I think there's an increased awareness of this activity, which is in the long run is going to behoove all of us in sort of combating this thing. Ransomware is I imagine most of the folks joining the conversation are familiar with it, but it is quite literally, bad actors taking information, data sets, networks hostage, either threatening to destroy them or holding them for ransom, for payout. And again, to your earlier question, if something is organically a financial sector type situation, that's something we're going to work with support from our partners like the FBI or Homeland Security Investigations. Whereas if something might be tangential to state-sponsored activity, that's when we're going to go right to our partners at the FBI and the intelligence community to make sure they're aware of what we've stumbled upon. So again, can't really say there's an uptick in activity, but happy to say I think there's an uptick in overall awareness.
So you have not seen a huge growth in ransomware attacks over the past year, for example?
I can't say I've seen a huge growth. What I have seen is a lot more early warning and awareness, and the ability for intervention by both, law enforcement agencies like DHS and CISA and private sector getting in there. I'll tell you this, Pete, the one thing when we go out and talk to the private sector, and a lot of times people who are in this line of work, they understand the resiliency piece, and they realize that, having that continuity of operations and safeguarding information and is paramount. But there's also, especially on the business side of the house, folks are concerned about getting, technical term, jammed up for not being in compliance with regulatory rules. And one thing we're very quick to say is, the first time that you as a business owner, you as a municipal administrator, you as a leader in the education world and so on, the first time that you're talking to a cyber person from the US Secret Service or the FBI should not be after the incident occurred, and it shouldn't be after you've been victimized. It needs to happen before. So one thing we've been doing is we've been engaged in extensive outreach in this regard. Even before COVID, we've conducted, I think in the time that I've been director, the last 20 months or so, about 6 or 7 different cyber incident simulations where we invite people in from the various sectors. We've done, I think, the energy sector, financial sector. I think next week we're doing mortgage and real estate. So we're trying to cover down to kind of get the word out. And I'm aware that our partners are doing the same.
What are other ways that the Secret Service, as I recall, I think 25 years ago when you came into the Secret Service, one of the first things you investigated was cybercrime in the financial realm. How has the Secret Service evolved? I don't mean in the 25 years, but maybe even in the past year to adapt to fighting cybercrime.
So back in 1995, I joined the service, and I started in our New York office. Coincidentally, that same year, that office stood up something called the Electronic Crimes Task Force. I'll talk about that in a second. Before I do, what I should tell you is back in the late 70s and throughout the 80s, we would stand up various financial fraud task forces all over the country. They weren't really linear, and they weren't really directed by headquarters. It was just capitalizing on opportunities in various areas. So some of the first violations that ECTF, as we used to call it, would work on were the old cell phone fraud things. And I joke that, nowadays we're used to having cell phones that are this big. Cell phones were gigantic, and they had huge antennas, and it had to do with counterfeit SIM cards and all this kind of stuff, and counterfeit calling cards. So they've come a long way. What we've realized in the last couple of years is that we were sort of traveling along the same paths with regard to our fraud task force and our electronic crimes task forces. So we made the decision to sort of merge those. And we kind of call them broadly the cyber fraud task force. Started with that first electronic crimes one back in '95. Today, we have more than 42 worldwide. We have 40 here domestically, 2 overseas. And then those are further enhanced because we're a relatively small agency, but we do have a global footprint. We're really thoughtful and deliberate about where we place our people around the country, and we want to make sure we're getting the most bang for a buck, obviously when it comes to our protective mission, but also when it comes to being regionally situated to best respond to and support our partners when it comes to fighting financial and cyber crimes.
So one of the things the Secret Service has done is set up this cyber advisory board. Tell us a little bit about that. What's it for? What does it do?
So the one opportunity we saw that was there was that we've always been great at partnerships, and we're always, working in earnest to kind of address what we think the needs of our clients and our partners are, if you will. But we also recognize that there was a gap, and we weren't really getting sort of the high level feedback of people who had varied experiences about what cybercrime means to them, what they see the vulnerabilities are, and what they see the needs are moving forward. So we designed this idea. We got this idea for the CIAB, the Cyber Investigation Advisory Board. Our Master of Ceremonies, John Carlin, is one of the 16 people on the board. And the best way I could put it is we look at it as a good idea machine. It's a sounding board. It's something where we want these folks to come in. These are experts from industry, from academia, former government leaders, and kind of give us a sense of, hey, this is what we're doing. This is where our focus is. Do you see where there's opportunities that we're not covering down we should, or are we missing something entirely? Just started it this past fall, already paying off huge dividends, and just, how do we go about not only hiring people who want to make a career in cyber law enforcement, but retaining them, because as you might imagine, cyber salaries out there in the private sector are just a little bit better than government salaries.
How do you operate in a sphere where cybercrime is increasingly global? It seems like many of these COVID frauds, for example, are originating from overseas. So what are the challenges for you to investigate those and, of course, to successfully prosecute or shut them down?
Right. So notwithstanding jurisdiction, combating cybercrime, it's a borderless war. And, the reality is you have to put a lot on the front end in terms of preparation and communication. Within the last several years, we decided to tear a book out of our protective operations playbook, and we established this thing called the GIOC, the Global Investigative Operations Center. It's a headquarters-based operation here in DC that's set up to support not just those 42 cyber fraud task forces, but our investigative mission around the globe. What we get out of that is you don't have those corollary investigations conducted by various fraud task forces and one doesn't know about the other. So it's great for establishing links. It's great for having that redundant communication with the various sectors and industry. And really, we've seen just such huge benefit from it already. We've already have partners in from the FBI joining us, and soon we're looking to welcome in private sector partners to be part of the GIOC as well.
Yeah, well, I want to follow up on that a little bit, because I talked about this at the beginning, but I sort of want to follow up on it. It does seem like, because of your protective mission, you are a little more out there looking at potential threats, obviously directed at your protectees, but are you perhaps a little more savvy to what's being said or the threats that are online as opposed to, say, other law enforcement agencies?
I feel confident that we do have our finger on the pulse, and that we're sort of very much in the moment and looking forward on it. I have no doubt that our partners are as well. But yes, we really do believe that in very many ways that our experience in threat management on the protective side of the house certainly enhances our abilities on the investigative side of the house, and vice versa. Matter of fact, one thing we've started probably in the last 5 to 7 years is on the protective side of the house. It's not an investigative effort, is something called the Critical Systems Protection Group, which is there to support our protective operations. We have right now more than 50 full-time protectees, which is an all-time high for us. Plus, as you know, we're responsible for protecting heads of state and heads of government when they visit. And then we have this other responsibility as the operational lead for these events called National Special Security events. CSP goes in there where we're doing physical stuff you're familiar with. You bring canine dogs and that kind of stuff. Well, CSP is doing all their stuff remotely, because if a protected person, whether it's the King of Spain, I'll just pick on that, is going into a building, then he is going to go into an elevator, and then he might go into a meeting hall, and he might go into another room. Well, you're passing through building space that's going to be controlled and accessible virtually. Elevators, HVAC, lighting, the list goes on and on and on. So we're basically, if you will, robbing from Peter to pay Paul on the protective side of the house, and that's one way that our missions blend.
Why is your number of protectees at an all-time high?
Well, we're in the middle of a transition, so that's one reason. But even before that, we had about 40. It's been, to be honest with you, it's probably been somewhere between high 30s and mid 40s since or about 2008, 2009. I'd have to look. It kind of vacillates, to be honest with you.
So you also have this National Computer Forensics Institute where you would train local law enforcement officials. What do you do there that they wouldn't learn about how to fight cybercrime somewhere else?
So NCFI down in Hoover, Alabama, it's a facility we opened up back in 2008. It is primarily, and until very recently, exclusively was for the purpose of training local, state, county, and tribal law enforcement, prosecutors, and judges. And when it comes to the law enforcement and the prosecutors, it's I won't say it's like a timeshare, but basically it's selfless and selfish at the same time. What we're doing is we're bringing these folks in, we're equipping them, we're kind of giving them the same training that we provide to our cyber folks. The idea is they can go back and support their own communities and their own needs, but at the same time, it's a force multiplier, because 9 times out of 10, these same folks then go back and join our cyber fraud task forces. Certainly first of its kind, largest of its kind. I'm actually not aware of any other facility that's doing what NCFI is doing.
So you're teaching them the technical aspects, the legal aspects, how to detect it. What are they learning there?
Absolutely. So you're looking for criminal procedure, the legal basis, things like how to detect network intrusion, how to combat things like ransomware. How do you go about detecting, when vulnerabilities exist to provide those to your partners out there in the private sector. So yeah, it's the whole host. I mean, basically those folks come out of there with much more than a basic working knowledge, and they're very close to being a cyber agent, if you will.
It seems like in the early days of the Department of Homeland Security, one of the things that they did was just telling industry, you need to do a better job of better fences around your chemical plants and better security at your nuclear plants and so forth. So in the cyber world, what is your sense of how good the private sector is? I mean, obviously banks have tended to be a little bit ahead of the rest of the world, but generally speaking, how good is private industry at protecting itself from cyber attacks?
Well, to go back to your earlier question, I would say exponentially better than they were even 2 years ago. When we roll out these information sessions, these cyber incident simulations, the level of interest we get is off the charts. People want to learn, they want to understand, they want to ensure not only readiness, but the ability to withstand some sort of anomaly or attack to their corporation, to their agency. So I think the good news is everybody's aware that this is not only a business challenge, but it's a national security challenge, and people are looking to be part of the fight.
In terms of the organization of the Secret Service, obviously it seems like the protective mission is still the sort of most attractive top tier thing to do. But is there now a sort of cyber cadre within the Secret Service where you can have a career fighting cybercrime?
There is, and that is relatively new. So on the agent side of the house, the career track is typically one would come on in one of the field offices domestically. We don't start you in Paris, but you start one of the field offices here. You do about anywhere between 4 and 6 years, and you do all the agent stuff. You do investigations, you do a lot of threat management, and then you do more than your fair share of supporting protective operations. That's phase one. Phase two, which is typically a DC-based phase, usually is down here in DC, and it's made up of a few different options, but the most notable are either going to the Presidential Protective Division or the Vice Presidential Protective Division, or if you're tactically inclined, you can go over and do SWAT type things, or if maybe you want to be involved in intelligence, you can do our intelligence work. And that's great. And that makes sense because we really do feel that those two missions are, symbiotic. However, we realized that we were taking people with real strong cyber experience, know-how, and then we were making them do protection for 4+ years, and then looking for them to go back to the field afterwards. They're no longer current. If their heart is in the fight against cyber crimes, then you're almost disincentivizing them, and almost encouraging them to go look for other opportunities, either within the federal government or private sector. So yes, we recently, within the last year or so, established a cyber investigator career track where if this is what somebody wants to do for their 20, 25+ year career in the Secret Service, we're happy to support it.
So last question for you, Mr. Murray, as you look forward to the coming year for the Secret Service until you come back to Aspen a year from now, what changes do you think you'll be making and what that you need to make to stay ahead of the curve?
Well, obviously we're looking forward to, on the protective side of the house, managing the transition. Once one campaign ends, we actually start working on the next campaign. So folks can expect that come March and April, we'll be working on the 2024 campaign and whatever comes
swell.
After that. Exactly. I'm sure folks in your line of work are doing the same thing. And then we are involved in a huge hiring push, what I think will amount to a decades-long hiring push. That's across all job series, not just investigator. And by the way, if somebody wants to work for the Secret Service and be involved in the fight against cybercrime, one does not need to be a special agent. You can come on as an analyst, you can come on as a whole host of different things. So we're looking to expand there. But again, as I noted earlier, our workforce is somewhere around 7,700 with the continued support of Congress and the administrations and OMB. We're looking to get to somewhere around 10,000 people in 2026. We really think that's necessary not only for our protective mission, but also to be able to be viable in this fight against cybercrime.
Well, Mr. Murray, thanks very much. Thank you for your time. James Murray of the Secret Service. Thank you all very much for your attention. Stay with us. We'll be back in just a moment.
Thank you, Director Murray and Pete Williams, for that excellent session. And thanks to our audience for joining us on the second day of our 5th annual Aspen Cyber Summit. I'm David Forsey, the Managing Director of the Aspen Cybersecurity Group, and it's my pleasure to introduce a conversation I'm particularly eager about, and that's the first session on space we have ever featured. Our National Cybersecurity Agenda, which we just released today, includes an important recommendation on designating commercial space as critical infrastructure to help accelerate adoption of basic cybersecurity practices in the space sector. So make sure to check that out through the link on our summit website, aspencybersummit.org. The website also includes the summit agenda and bios for all of our speakers. I also want to thank FireEye, Intel, and Proofpoint for making this week's summit possible and helping us convene such an important set of conversations to help us understand such a complicated year. We would also like to acknowledge Blue Vector, SIGPA NA, and the American Gas Association for their additional support. I'm now pleased to introduce Lindsay Shepard, a fellow at the International Security Program at CSIS, who will be leading a discussion on the cyber threat landscape in outer space. Lindsay, over to you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, David, for the kind introduction. I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. It is so incredibly timely, particularly given your new Aspen report. That really calls out, the critical services that depend on timing infrastructure or timing information transmitted by GPS satellites or Earth observation data. We increasingly have internet communications that are transiting orbiting infrastructure. 5G global networks are being built. And this is all really happening at trends where we have new technology democratization, particularly in the civilian space. Where we have increased access to and dependence on space. So we have a merging of different silos of national security, civilian, new startups and new entrants into the market, as well as our traditional players in the defense industrial base. So to really unpack all of these different angles and this intersection of space and cybersecurity, I am honored to be joined today by my 3 esteemed colleagues who I see have just revealed themselves to the audience. So I'm going to go kind of in the order as I see them. Perhaps you guys want to give a little wave, just in case we're not on the same order as I introduce you. But I first have up Jack Blackhurst, who is the Executive Director of the Air Force Research Lab, AFRL, where he is responsible for managing the Air Force's $2.5 billion science and technology program, along with the additional $2.3 billion of externally funded research and development. This does include a partnership that is the Air Force's first space accelerator, the Catalyst Space Accelerator, in addition to a brand new cybersecurity space accelerator. Next up on my screen, I have Captain Ed Divini, who is now the Corporate Director of Cyber Programs at Northrop Grumman. Previously, he had retired from the U.S. Navy, where he was notably the commander of the USS Cole from December of 2008 to July of 2010. And then following that, he had tours at the Pentagon and Fort Meade, where he focused on strategic cyber defense and strategic partnerships. And then finally up, I have Aaron Miller, who is the Vice President of Operations at Space ISAC, or an Information Sharing and Analysis Center, which is a public-private partnership that is really aimed at closing the information sharing gaps within both the cybersecurity and space communities. So we're talking about goals of enhancing the community's ability to prepare and respond to vulnerabilities, to incidents, to threats, being able to disseminate timely information and kind of serve as that primary communications channel. So before we open up for a discussion with our wonderful panelists, we're going to save about the last 15 to 20 minutes for audience Q&A if you guys have questions. So please feel free to send questions as they come to you using the Q&A function. Your name, affiliation, a short question, and please do let me know if you have a question directed at a particular panelist. Otherwise, I will fire at will, and Jack, Aaron, and Ed will be at my mercy. So to begin, I'd really like to turn to Aaron, because I think you are best poised to answer the question for us, is help us frame up this discussion. So what are the major trends that we're seeing that have brought us together today to discuss this? Technological, economic, geopolitical, that are really driving this merging of the cybersecurity and space sector.
Sure, thanks, Lindsay. And thanks for having me here. I'm really proud to be on this panel, accompanied by one of our founding board members. And of course, your leadership, Dr. Blackhurst, is AFRL is also very appreciated. To frame up the conversation around what are we seeing as far as trends, I think there's a couple of key trends that are really impacting the direction of where we're headed for protecting against cybersecurity threats to space. And those are around the low barriers to entry to get into the marketplace. We're still seeing that we're projected to grow to $1 trillion by 2040. That is the global space economy, as well as we're seeing, and that's from the Space Foundation, by the way. So 80% also of that is the global space economy is commercial. So we're really creating a lot of need for awareness and education resources to small and medium-sized companies. And that's one of the primary objectives of the Space ISAC, is to educate around those topics. And we've also got some emerging technologies that are coming out that are being widely adopted, like the adoption of cloud for ground stations, and some fairly large players in that space like Microsoft and Amazon. Of course, 5G, as you mentioned, is a big opportunity here as we see the direct interconnectedness between our terrestrial network and our space layer of that network, tourism, and then the cybersecurity technology advancements that we've already begun to see and understand allow us to realize what vulnerabilities exist. So I think because we know that there are vulnerabilities in every system, then the broader expansion of the globe, across the globe of the space systems allows for a larger attack vector. And we're now becoming very aware of this. We're talking about it and having regular dialogue. And the more people that we get involved as civilians who are exposed to safety concerns, then the more we need to consider these attack vectors, and the more we're going to have to pay attention to cybersecurity. So there's a lot of situations that we're seeing where signals are being pirated that are being routed through space-based networks in order to land in the US and attack a US-based company, and you can't trace those back. So in order to resolve this, we need to create solutions to these cybersecurity threats where we have SATCOM operators that are talking to network operators, and this requires international collaboration. So I think all of the global interconnectedness of our space missions being used by so many different sectors is really impacting our need to address cybersecurity issues.
Wonderful, thank you. It's a perfect segue to Jack. I think I can turn to you next to build on what Erin said. She alluded to the threats. How are the threats different in this domain, bringing in space and cybersecurity? And are there different challenges in the context of the space sector from other cybersecurity aspects? Thinking through what are those practical limitations? Is this easier to manage? Is it harder to manage? Help us understand that threat landscape a little bit better.
Okay, well, thanks for having me today. Certainly to be a pleasure to be here. The fact that space is now a warfighting domain and multiple nations and non-state actors are starting to display malicious behavior in space. Obviously, the proliferation of commercial LEO satellites also introduced multiple new access and points for cyber intrusion and compromise. We are obviously interested in space cybersecurity from a national security perspective. We rely on our space assets in time of war, so need to assure adequate cybersecurity and resiliency. Potential elements of the commercial space sector that the USSF routinely relies on for mission critical functions could be designated as critical infrastructure. This is something we are looking at from a policy and norms of behavior in space perspective. The implication would be of maintenance of certain protection resiliency levels required on commercial assets so designated.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Had a little keyword malfunction here. I think you actually, Jack, teed up a really interesting question that I know the new Aspen report hits on. So Ed, I think I'd like to turn to you now. So you mentioned the possibility of designating commercial space as critical infrastructure. So for our audience, national space is critical infrastructure. And there are now pros and cons and trade-offs that we're having to make as we think through this designation. I know the new Aspen report, and I certainly recommend you guys to read into it, does recommend this designation. So Ed, can you maybe give us a little bit of a primer on commercial space as critical infrastructure. Help us understand those trade-offs that are inherent in that.
Certainly, Zia, and I'd also like to echo my fellow panelists' comments. Honored to be here for sure, and it's a great opportunity to address what is a critical problem in our country that we need to all face together. An interesting thing about cyber, just to add a little bit to what Jack said about what's different and unique about cyber with space assets is it's an interesting hybrid architecture. If you think about the assets that are flying around, the satellites that are flying around, many of them are very old, but yet the ground stations can be very modern, up to date technology. So how do you secure a hybrid system that is a myriad of ancient, what way to talk about ancient hardware and up to date software? It's interesting. Some of our young engineers are working on satellites that are older than they are. So it's interesting and it's a difficult problem to address. To your point about having space designated as critical infrastructure, I think we understand as a society the critical reliance that we have upon space-based assets. I think it's to the point where American public, or basically the global public, doesn't really think about how much they get from space, whether it's timing signals, whether it's GPS, whether it's weather data, phones, video. Much of everything that we do is likely bouncing at some point off of some space asset. So whether or not it is chosen as critical infrastructure, I think it's important to know that if it is eventually deemed so, it will help the country understand and coalesce around securing these systems to the highest degree that is necessary, as dictated for the particular system. Certainly, every system is going to have a varying level of security that's required based upon its mission need.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think, Aaron, that gives me, a nice segue to turn to you in your, unique position between both the public and private enterprise. Is, thinking through, what we have all of these new space companies that are coming into the market. And as both Jack and Ed have mentioned, it's not just, the space assets themselves, but it's the ground infrastructure that has to be secured. It's the personnel and the offices. So how do we think through, getting some of the lessons learned from government and industry, those folks that have been there, to these new entrants into the space startup world?
Yeah, I think in 2015, 16, they were already starting to contemplate this. So there's been some great groundwork that's been laid. The S&T Partnership Forum that's chaired by NASA, actually, they conducted a study with MITRE that led to the observation and the report that we needed to break down the public-private sector, the silos that had been created, and start to address how are we going to create regular dialogue and communication between the federal government and the private sector industry, especially those small, medium-sized businesses and the rest of the space sector. And so they declared the need that we stand up a space ISAC for that purpose. So in the space ISAC, a lot of activities that we're going to be doing that will generate applied lessons learned and best practices for the community, our information sharing and our analysts working group, generating notices, incidents of compromise, giving the community access to reports on vulnerabilities, and disseminating the timely information that they need to be able to respond to a situation that might be impacting the community at large, and also that could be impacting their company directly, or a system that they have in particular. So we're going to have analyst working groups, as well as daily reports that we're already issuing, and we're planning to spin out threat working groups that are based on specific areas where we can dive deeper into these threat areas. And typically these types of environments where you have companies that are collaborating with each other and sharing the incidents that they're observing, making recommendations on best practices, this is a really unique environment. You don't find this anywhere outside of an ISAC typically. So we believe that we're going to be serving this community that you're talking about here in this question pretty extensively for the next decades as we bring together this commercial, government, and international collaboration to share best practices.
Wonderful, thank you. So Jack, turning back to you. So how does the federal government's unique interest in space shape its interest in more mature cybersecurity programs in both the national security and the commercial sectors?
So I would say, so as we move into the more digital environment, and that's a big push within the United States Department of Defense, is to go digital. The need to protect the data while static and in motion is critical. Our adversaries are going to target our digital systems and transport layers to either exfiltrate or alter data. Insider threat is also a concern, but with more data being stored in digital form, such as system models, mission models, etc., the risk is much greater. Since the digital transformation relies heavily on commercial applications, we are defining a method to more rapidly assess commercial software for use in our cloud environments, define a security reference architecture, survey multi-level security methods, develop the digital security classification guides, and lastly, coordinates activities across OSD and the services to identify gaps, needs, and barriers relative to existing policies. For example, I'll give you one example. So we have a program called Global Lightning. Global Lightning is a series of LEO satellites to be a space internet. Okay, so typically what we do, as you know, through the Air Force, is we do the research, we build a satellite, we launch the satellite, we operate the satellite, and then we replace the satellite at a point in time. Well, under this Global Lightning program, we'll buy a service. We will buy a service from a commercial vendor, and we will use that service to provide communications throughout the DoD environment, but it's on a commercial platform. And it's like buying your internet for your home. We'll be buying internet as a service for the Department of Defense. So you can easily see where the potentials for cybersecurity concerns are there, and that we're going to have to address that through the commercial vendor.
Thank you. So Ed, before we open it up to the audience Q&A, I wanted to give you the opportunity from your position coming from military service now into the private sector to build upon the trends that Jack identified. What are you guys seeing, coming down the road in the next, 5 years or so that are critical trends that you guys are having to watch out for and development you're having to target?
Thank you, Lindsay. The one thing that I would like to highlight as well is that, back to your former question, if I could add one more thing, what are the trends that we're seeing that can be applied from both government to civil space that apply to everyone? And I think it goes back to your original question on what's unique and different about cybersecurity and space. And we talked a little bit about what's different, but what's the same is cybersecurity is cybersecurity. The basic tenets of implementing sound cybersecurity practices applied no matter what the system is, no matter what environment that system lies in. And that is what we are sharing sort of with our supply chain and all of our vendors. We've got 15 or so thousand vendors that we do business with on a routine basis. And, we are encouraging them and practicing ourselves, the core tenets of good cybersecurity, in that you have to research and incorporate cybersecurity at the most basic level of your systems, and not wait to try and bolt it on to something at the very end. You want to integrate the cybersecurity, both cybersecurity and cyber survivability, into your systems from the ground up and integrate it in, not bolt it on. And it's cheaper and more effective to do it that way. And you also have to build in a way to upgrade it. And as we talked about before, when one of your assets is up in space, the ground system obviously you can work on, but once it's up in space, you don't have the ability to get to it anymore. So you got to build in the ability to upgrade the system and do your best to maintain it over time. So, and I hope that answered your question. If you'd like me to follow on, happy to.
No, that's wonderful. I think, one thing that particularly has come to the fore in both, the 5G discussion as well as, as we continue to work our way through COVID is this idea of having supply chain security and pointing out from your position at the defense industrial base is the relationships to the variety of vendors and having to think through, building up, their own cybersecurity practices and their own resiliency. And then, getting into some good old system design principles of, how do we build modular, flexible, adaptable systems that can evolve. So I do see that we have a stop at 1:10 and we have some questions from the audience. So I'd really like to get to those. So Jack, if you don't mind, I'd like to come back to you. One question highlighted the recent Air Force Hack-A-Satellite competition. That I think is really a great example of, bringing, civilian ingenuity and innovation into the Air Force and into that ecosystem. So if you could, maybe expand a little bit on any particular lessons learned or where, you at AFRL would like to go forward in similar exercises and practices.
Yeah, of course. So first of all, that's a theme. Things like Hack-A-Sat, tech accelerators, quantum colliders. We're having a quantum collider today where we bring lots of people around the nation. And it's not only the nation, it's the world. When we did the Hack-A-Sat, we had international competitions. And I think countries like Poland and others actually did very well in the competition. And so it's interesting to bring a lot of variety of individuals to the table to participate in these activities and to learn from each other. And it's just amazing. I think the fact that, and we have pitch days, and we had our first UK space pitch day this past month or so kind of thing. And so it's not just a domestic or national thing anymore. It's really becoming an international flavor. And we're going to have international partners playing in these events. So I think it's exciting. You're going to see a lot more of that, and you're going to see a lot more of collaboration between countries as well as companies, as well as government agencies playing in these activities.
Wonderful. Thank you. I will direct, let's see, the next one to Erin, because she does have her, spanning a variety of fields and a variety of sectors. So if you could help us understand a little bit about from this viewpoint, how do we consider hardware security when we're thinking about space security?
Oh, sure. Well, the Space ISAC has taken the approach of defining the threat areas for the Space ISAC in our priority intelligence requirements document. So one of the first activities that we took on actually when we stood up the Space ISAC is to determine that we were an all threats, all hazards organization, which definitely includes hardware and softwares and operations technology. Of course, it includes the entire supply chain, business systems, and most importantly, the space mission itself. So I think that we can't neglect any component of the mission. We have members that represent across a variety of different subsectors. And so all of these elements come to play in almost every facet of what they're doing. So we're looking at companies who are payload designers being part of the Space ISAC, communications companies, launch providers, cloud and data processing. So security runs the whole gamut. You can't really just isolate it as one specific area. And we're taking that approach in the Space ISAC.
Wonderful, thank you. I'd like to direct this next one to Ed because it is a topic that you actually kind of briefly mentioned in your answer to the final question. And so the question is the relationship between hardware and software. So in the automotive industry, they state as a great example where hardware lags software because of these legacy systems such as ops, design, and manufacturing. And I know you had touched on this previously in your answer about the fact that we can't just pull a satellite into a garage for a repair. So help us understand for And maybe if you can do like a quick two-prong approach, how are we addressing this for legacy systems? But then looking forward at new systems, how are we designing this into our systems, with the understanding that, once that system is up in space, I can't just pull it down for repair.
Right. Well, that's a good question. Thank you. The one thing that certainly with space-based systems that you want to make sure, no matter whether it's hardware or software, that one, it's survivable and it'll last a long time. And then also we're building in the ability to upgrade and also building in backup systems, because if there's some hardware fault, you want to be able to default back to a second set of hardware. So there's a rigorous process of testing to make sure that everything that flies is good and will be good. But the ability to upgrade the system and to modernize it the best we can is really critical. It's a critical component, and it's a difficult problem, especially in the hardware, as you mentioned. The software, we can load new software, and that's relatively easily done. But that goes back to sort of your core statement about good engineering hygiene practices. You really have to build in the appropriate levels of security based upon the mission needs, and that cost versus return on investment is really a difficult problem in the cyber arena in particular, because you can't immediately quantify the results of your investment. So it's a constant discussion with all of our customers on how much is required cybersecurity wise for a particular system, which will drive all of the requirements. But we want to build it in on the front end so it's cheaper and more effective as throughout the life of the system.
Thank you. Jack, I'd like to turn to you next because we do have another question that digs into a little bit of theme that you've been mentioning, which is the role of civilian and commercial assets. So William Hederman asks that if by using civilian space assets for communication, does that actually expose these civilian assets to greater threat? How are we thinking through the kind of dual use nature of a lot of these upcoming space assets?
That's a good question. We're just on the throes of doing that. And so that's obviously an evaluation. The first question a warfighter is going to ask about the space internet I was talking to you about is the vulnerabilities. What are those vulnerabilities and how are you going to deal with them? And so I think that's part of our research activity as we go and test these things out and determine what works, what doesn't work, and make sure that the commercial vendors are incorporating the notional cybersecurity principles and activities that will allow us to make it secure. But I think we're only going to be doing that through piloting and demonstrating that they actually can be secure devices.
Wonderful. Thank you. So I have one more question I'm going to turn to Aaron, and then in the remaining time, I'd like to go around the horn and everybody just give Jack, Aaron, and Ed, you the opportunity as we're in our final minutes to, share, what is the one big takeaway you want our audience to leave this session with? So you guys, Aaron, I'm sorry, I'm going to put you on the spot, and then while Ed and Jack think. But the last question is for you from Kelvin Westbrook. How can we increase the awareness of the relevance of space risks to our companies? So many of which don't readily see or understand the connection to their operations. And I think this is one that you are perfectly poised to address.
Yeah, I mean, the obvious answer from my standpoint is establish an organization that's their mission, is to share threat intelligence, which includes information about the risk and vulnerabilities regularly and widely disseminate. And we do have the ability to disseminate to the public. So if there's something that's actually shared within the Space ISAC that needs to be distributed to the public, we can do that. We also are forming partnerships with the government. So we have active collaborations and we are forming formal information sharing agreements with a variety of different agencies. So that allows for that back and forth flow of information that's extremely essential to promote awareness, because there's been some myths out there that, it's all classified. There's no way we could ever learn anything about the threats and vulnerabilities to space. Well, in fact, the reality is that, as Dr. Blackhurst and others are discussing daily, that there are commercial solutions that are out there that are being used even by the US military, that we need to be having these dialogues regularly. So that's why the Space ISAC is a global information sharing environment, so that we can promote this awareness across the globe.
Wonderful, thank you. And I'm curious, just a quick follow-up is, how do you guys, or how do you think through, outreach and bringing awareness to those companies that may not think of themselves as space companies or being impacted by space? So how do you, evangelize to them that space cybersecurity does matter?
Yeah, I think cross-sector pollination is really important, especially when it comes to the space sector, because the applications of the space community are so broad. And what we're doing is we're partnering with other ISACs. So we are a member of the National Council of ISACs, and we're able to coordinate with those other communities, communications, financial services, auto, aviation, and where there's cross-pollination, and there's a lot because space is, in a sense, it's kind of like the critical infrastructure of all critical infrastructures, because so many others depend upon it. So that's what we're leveraging right now, and we'll continue to grow. Since we only launched last year, then this is still just the beginning of a multi-decade effort.
Awesome, thank you so much. Well, now I'd like to give, our three esteemed panelists an opportunity to, share any last parting words or bits of wisdom that they would really like for the Aspen audience to take home with them. Thank you all again for joining us today. It's been really wonderful to be here to have this discussion. So Jack, I will turn it over to you if you have your final words for us.
Words for me is it's an exciting time to be in space. We're coming up on the first anniversary of the United States Space Force here in December, the 20th of December. It has been exciting for us for this past year to engage with the new service as they look at their clean sheet designs of how they're going to do business. And it's just, it's overall, it's an exciting time. And we're looking forward to working not only with the Space Force, but with the industries and the small businesses.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Ed, over to you.
Thank you, Lindsay. Look, I would encourage everyone to, no matter which organization you're from, to just ensure that you're doing a good risk assessment with cyber vulnerabilities. And in this case, it pertains to space, but frankly, it pertains to every aspect, every connection you have with your organization, outside of your organization, that you really have to consider the cyber threat landscape in it. And they're not easy discussions. And as I said before, the return on investment versus the cost is difficult sometimes to define, but the implications of not taking action certainly can far outweigh the cost of investment on the front end. So if you're building something new, make sure you're building it from the ground up right. And if you're not building something, make sure the infrastructure by which you and your company or your organization relies upon is secure.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ed. And then Aaron, hopefully we gave you a little bit of time to think through your answer, since I made you answer the last question before that. But I will give you the final word of our panelists.
Yeah, to the space community and to others who are supporting the space community, we're looking forward to being a long-term resource for you on topics like this, all threats, all hazards to space. And if you are a cybersecurity company that's trying to get into space to protect that sector, then, or you are actually just a member of the space community, then please feel free to reach out to me. Our goal is always to keep it very pragmatic and to use use cases and case studies and not overemphasize the fear factor, because it's just a reality that we need to protect ourselves against threats and vulnerabilities. So I look forward to hearing from anyone who wants to reach out to me directly. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, again, Jack, Aaron, Ed, thank you again for joining us today. We are actually a few minutes early, so David, I will turn it over to you. At least we did not commit the cardinal sin of taking the next panel's time. But again, it's been really wonderful being here with everybody today, and I will now turn it over to the Aspen crew.
Okay, hello everybody, welcome back, and thank you again for joining us for the 5th annual Aspen Cyber Summit. I'm Vivian Schiller, the Executive Director of Aspen Digital, and it is my pleasure to introduce our next section about disinformation and the 2020 election, and what I'm sure is going to be a particularly fascinating conversation today with some of the smartest and most interesting and most fun people that I know in this topic. As a reminder, the full summit agenda and bios of all our speakers are available at aspencybersummit.org. I want to again thank FireEye, Intel, and Proofpoint for making this week's summit possible and helping us convene such an important set of conversations and help us understand such a complicated year. We also would like to acknowledge Blue Vector, SIGPA NA, and the American Gas Association for their additional support. I am now so pleased to introduce Charlie Warzel, a writer at large for the New York Times and one of the most incisive observers of the oddities of our modern world of information. Charlie, over to you.
Hello. Hi. Thank you, Vivian. I appreciate it. I'm really excited today to get a chance to talk in front of all of you with everyone here. We're going to talk about this crazy world that we've all been living in, and a little bit about where we go from here. But my esteemed guests today are Dr. Joan Donovan, Research Director at the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Joan is basically everywhere all the time as one of the most cited academic experts in this field that has really sort of pioneered a lot of this, and I think has been one of the primary educators of journalists like myself, really sort of bringing and helping to bridge that gap between the academic world and the journalistic practitioners, and really sort of narrowing that down. We have Nathaniel Gleicher, the head of cybersecurity policy at Facebook. Sort of enough said there. Nathaniel's been on the absolute front lines as someone who has been working on election security at the absolute highest level, seeing things from a vantage point that most of us really can only sort of dream of being able to look at that. So really excited to get some insights, and also joined today by Yasmin Green, the Director of Research and Development at Jigsaw, a division of Google that does research, builds tools and services, works with global news orgs, campaign offices, NGOs, is really thoughtful and helpful in understanding the internet's role in online radicalization in so many of the thorny problems that we're all dealing with. So I'm absolutely thrilled and honored that you guys are here to talk with me up in my attic where I'm being apparently held hostage. So thank you very much for all of this. Let's just start right at the gates because we only have limited time here. You may or may not have heard there was an election recently. This is going to be kind of reductive here, but to sort of start us off, I'd love to get your just go down the line, starting with Joe and then Nathaniel, Yasmin, of your report card, like how this went from a misinformation perspective, and like reason it out for me. What are some of your top line failures and successes here that you saw, play out, let's say between late October and the day that the GSA allowed the Biden transition. So yeah, Joan, if you want to go first.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me. And I could not be nearly as smart as I am without the patient contributions of my colleagues and teammates, as well as everybody else in this field, including our industry experts on this panel today. There's been a lot of conversation over the last several years about how do we deal with what's going to happen in 2020. And I think nobody really anticipated the curveball of a pandemic happening in the midst of trying to corral what was going to be a very contentious election because of the kind of enormous fanfare and power that's been on display around the Trump administration, and sort of the way in which they can capture so much attention, take up so much space in the world as an administration that really understood media first, beyond just governing, but being a kind of show in and of itself. And so one of the things I think that was really an important thing to mark is the way in which everybody knew that something was going to happen in October, right? We all were kind of waiting for what the big October surprise was going to be. And for my team, we had been tracking lots of different attempts to try to make Hunter Biden the lead story for months and months and months. And so for us, we knew that it was going to come in that form, and we didn't know exactly, if it was going to be a leak or what it was going to be. But when the laptop showed up, that really curious computer repairman that was just trying to collect his $85 on a laptop that had been brought in by an anonymous person that just happened to have, sex vids, crack rocks, and 10,000 emails committing crimes, I mean, none of it felt right. None of it fit right. And so I think that when the media, as the news organizations decided to investigate the story in their own different ways, I think many of us were really suspicious about the origins of that story and about what would happen if people were to uncritically accept this malinformation, let's call it, as fact, and run with it, and then how that might sway people's attitudes about the challenger Biden. And so I think that for me, one of the biggest non-surprises but interesting ways of handling a moment like that played out in October, as well as how the media had to grapple with dealing with Trump getting coronavirus. I mean, here you have an opportunity where we can do a lot of public education about what coronavirus is, how it affects people, how it affects your entire, system. And it becomes about, the story becomes about, his, ability to fend off the virus and come out like Superman. And so I feel like there was a lot of strange things that happened in the lead up to the election that weren't necessarily about the election, but didn't necessarily interfere with what I think was the most important thing, which was getting out the vote and getting people out to the polls. And so for me, I think that was the big win, even though there was some, trials and tribulations along the way, that we had so many people go out to vote in the midst of a pandemic where there were real serious risks. And now we're dealing with the fallout of, allegations of voter fraud. And I hope we talk about what's going on with CISA and whatnot later. But for me, in the lead up to the election anyway, those were my big pain points, as well as I was really kind kind of intrigued by the way in which the media and platform companies reckoned with this kind of misinformation that was really an enormous feat.
Yeah. So, Nathaniel, you have, obviously, as I said in the intro, you have a different and really sort of frontline perspective on this. I mean, what are your sort of, what were some of your surprises and where do you see successes and failures there?
Sure. Well, Charlie, thanks, and everyone, thanks for having me on the call and the discussion. It's great to be here to get to talk with Yasmin and Joan and you and work through this stuff. And I think we're at a really interesting moment where we have the election is passed. We can look back at a lot of work that was done sort of in the heat. It was done under fire as all the teams that were trying to protect public debate were trying to figure out how to get ahead of the challenges they were seeing. I think a lot of the work of the next few years and some important work is going to be looking at some of the lessons we can draw from what happened over the last 4 years and thinking, how can we institutionalize them? How can we make them more permanent? How can we build out the whole of society response? And so this conversation is at a really interesting time, and it's a great opportunity to look back and look forward. So I'm glad we're getting to do that. The biggest difference, and I think it's the first thing to say is the biggest difference between, for example, 2016 and 2020 in the United States is that in 2020, you had teams of determined defenders at the platforms, in government, in civil society, in the media, that were focused on how to protect public debate from day one and running through the tape after the election. And we're working pretty shoulder to shoulder. I think one of the key lessons is that protecting an election is a whole of society problem. I think there are really critical things that journalists can do, but journalists by themselves can't carry this. I think that there are really important structural things that platforms can do. But again, platforms are one target for this, and they're one piece of the public debate. There are really important things that government can do in civil society. And having all of those teams together made a huge difference around the election. The other thing that I would say is I would open the aperture a little bit. So the core of my team's work is our security work, finding and exposing, for example, influence operations, sophisticated campaigns trying to target public debate. And for that, I wouldn't think just about the few weeks around the election, because to run an influence operation to target public debate, you need to build up often an audience, you need to build up assets on these platforms. Over the course of 2019 and 2020, so the end of 2019 and through 2020, we removed about a dozen operations being run by foreign actors that were targeting public debate in the United States. And what's interesting is most of them were timed such that if they had lasted until the election, they would have been optimally placed to have built an audience and to target public discussion right in those final weeks. But because they were exposed and removed earlier, they didn't have that opportunity. And that was a result of a lot of work from government. FBI did really remarkable work in finding and exposing some of these things, sharing information with us, some of the teams at the platforms, and independent researchers. It really took that tool out of the tool belt of the bad actors. We also found about 5 deceptive campaigns using similar techniques being run by domestic actors in the United States, and announced those over the course of 2020. So these were operations run by political actors in the US. One of the prominent campaigns that we removed was linked to Roger Stone and some of his associates, and also showed some links to the Proud Boys, for example, using inauthentic techniques to hide who they were. And then as we got closer to the election, one of the things that happens around any civic moment is you see not just a big spike in public debate, but a big spike in people trying to target that public debate. And for example, use deceptive techniques to falsely amplify their message. You want to put out a false narrative, and then you want to trick people into thinking it's more popular than it is. And so we found a number of operations like this and removed them, announced some of them, pulled them down, and tried to sort of reduce the volume of that type of amplification. So overall, I think there were a couple of lessons from the election. The first is it's a whole of society challenge, and we really saw that. And I think Joan's example of what happened around the laptop is a really good instance of seeing a bunch of different communities pull together. That was my cat. She may reappear. The second is that it starts pretty early, and you see a bunch of different problems put together. There's this problem of inauthentic actors. And then there's this problem of authentic people spreading false narratives in their real names and how you deal with that. And these are different challenges. But all in all, I would just say Krebs, the former director of CISA, called this the most secure election in the nation's history. I agree with that. And I think that for all of the efforts and all of the challenges and the disinformation and the attempts to undermine public debate, it was an incredibly secure election, and it was run by some real patriots in government who drove it through and made sure that there was accurate information out there so that we could get to where we are today.
Yasmin, I'll let you build on this and tell us what you saw from your perspective, and then after that, I want to kind of loop back to Nathaniel here and just something I've seen in my own reporting. But I'd love to hear your take.
Yeah, so let me echo the thanks that Joan and Nathaniel expressed. I'd love to be involved with things that Aspen are doing next time in Aspen, please. I think I would add, so I feel pretty good about how we did as an industry on the tech side. And for those that don't know, Jigsaw is within Google. So even though I'm not on the front line in the same way that Nathaniel is, I'm not responsible for the election integrity efforts. I definitely had a front row seat in terms of seeing what was happening. And the reason that I would give good marks is because I felt that the ecosystem really moved this time to help the platforms do their best, which is really consistent with what Joan was saying. Like there were academia, civil society groups. There were groups that have been around for 100+ years. There were groups that have, that stood up just in the last 12 months. With the explicit goal of like briefing and publishing and influencing so that the tech platforms could understand what was special about this year. For example, calling in, people search for election results and election night loses its importance. Actually, it's important for a different reason because it's not conclusive on election night. And I don't think there was a person, the major platforms who didn't understand that and didn't prepare for that. So what was special about the election, and then also the disinformation narratives that were likely to gain traction and purchase in terms of things like mail-in ballots and election fraud. So there was so much support and generosity and just relentless energy around helping educate people in the platforms who are not election experts for the most part. And then I'd say that I saw a lot of individuals ranging from software engineers to designers to communication experts within tech companies get really smart and really deep on the threats that the platforms would face and the vulnerability to abuse this time around. So I feel really good about that. I also think I'm interested to get to how much these wins will benefit us going forward, just in terms of like can't get so deep and so smart on every issue that that is the context for disinfo. And so I'm hopeful, like Joan, that COVID is going to be another one where you're going to have a lot of people at the tech platforms getting really smart on vaccine development, life cycles and other aspects that people will be interested in using search and social media to find out about.
I think all that is super important to keep in context here. But one thing that I wanted to push a little for all of you on is at the same time, I think this was a huge win across the board. There was security, like even from the basic like counting the votes standpoint, like this was ran very smoothly in a lot of states where there were even some concerns on the ground. Like it seems like things went really very smoothly. But one thing that I think is hard to reconcile that with is that, we had, coming from the White House, we had just a absolute, waterfall of misinformation, directed at undermining the integrity of the election. We have a lot of activity on these platforms from people, in service of that. And I think that, there's still a very dangerous feeling talking to people in my worlds that there's going to be a very large swath of the population that, that perceives this election as illegitimate, and that's something that we're just going to have to carry through, and deal with. And I'm just curious how you guys how you guys think about that, because in one sense, there's so many things that were done right. There was so much pre-bunking and planning and education, and I think that it's basically things went off almost as well as one could hope for, and yet still we're dealing with a really, really difficult and very concerning issue coming from a minority of the country, but still a very significant portion. So I'm curious how you guys kind of grapple with all of that, and whoever wants to take it first. But I personally have a really hard time as a journalist weighing those two things, the successes and just the reality that there's a lot of people living in an alternate reality right now.
Well, I can offer a thought, which is just, when you're dealing with a security challenge, you can have a lot of success and you can also have a lot of risk and be in a very difficult situation. And I think that's sort of the reality. We know that, I mentioned there were sort of two components here, right? You have actors that are trying to be inauthentic, and then you have people that in their authentic voice are pushing false narratives. And when you have really prominent figures, and when you have prominent figures in the White House or in government pushing those narratives, that's an incredibly hard challenge for public debate and for the system of public debate. And it's interesting, one of the consequences of working at Facebook is you protect elections around the world. Since 2016, we've protected more than hundreds of them. And my team has worked on them in a bunch of different countries. And we've seen what it's like to be in situations when the government is a determined driver of deception, right? In this context, we had some very strong voices from government in civil society, at CISA, at FBI, who were really key players in dealing with this. But whenever you have prominent voices pushing these narratives, I think that's a hard challenge for all of the public debate. And it's not an easy question. One of the lessons, whether you're talking about a foreign actor or a domestic actor or whoever, that I think we should take away from this is influence operations or manipulation is most effective at times of uncertainty. It's most effective at times of where people don't know what the right answers are. And they're looking for answers and they're looking for someone to lead them. And how we get accurate information out and we amplify it so people can see it and feel confident and do the judging themselves, how we put more context around public debate is, I think, extremely important. It doesn't remove these challenges, but it does make us more resilient to them. And it's something that I think the platforms need to think a lot about. I also think it's something media needs to think a lot about and did, quite frankly. How do you cover these stories? How do you get this information out there? And how do you responsibly engage with this, given the prominent voices it's coming from?
I think from my perspective, when I start to think about misinformation at scale, right? Everybody knows that meme, like, can't go to bed right now, honey, somebody's wrong on the internet, right? That's not what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with a problem of scale, right? And the top Silicon Valley social media companies have spent a lot of money, resources, time over the last decade scaling their services. So it's not, it doesn't take a sociologist to tell you that when you build something that large, that very powerful people with resources are going to try to turn it to their advantage, especially when it's pretty much an unregulated broadcast amplification system. Not broadcast in the traditional sense of like their publishers, but broadcast in the sense of what social media does really well is scale information, right? And we saw this with some of our most important movements of the last decade, including Black Lives Matter. Nobody would probably know the names of people like, Walter Scott or Tamir Rice if it hadn't been for access to social media and people being able to get the evidence out. And so there are clear instances where we know that scale is going to matter in terms of forcing accountability. The issue is when those righteous uses of social media are turned against us by people who are really trying to push information in their own vested, interest. And right now we're, working through a deluge of misinformation about, very nuanced topics, right? They're always trying to split things. First it was absentee ballots versus mail-in ballots. You got to understand the nuance. And now it's not voter fraud, it's election fraud. You got to know the nuance, right? And as people start to search for that nuance, as Nathaniel's saying, like, that's when they end up encountering misinformation. And this is where, the vaccine question is going to be a really potent one, because when people start looking up mRNA because they don't know what the vaccine does, you don't want them finding medical misinformation before they find accurate information. And so, but the question of scale and power is really at the center here, which is when people in power can use that scale against society, then we have to think differently about what the product even is.
So I think this is a good place to kind of pivot to actually where, Yasmin, you said you were hoping we would go, which is taking some of these lessons and things that we have seen, and moving them towards, the next phase, a lot of that, which will be this vaccine rollout, which will be, the continuing fight against COVID misinformation, and all that to do with the pandemic. It's going to be obviously a very dark winter, and then followed by probably a very unprecedented time period and rollout of a worldwide vaccine. I am curious a little bit about, what Joan sort of addressed it, but we're seeing, the way that these nuances are exploited, the way that this news is made to be a little more convoluted, that the vagaries involved will be sort of weaponized against people, so that you can open the door for medical misinformation, vaccine information. But I'm curious, Yasmin, as you sort of survey, the next couple months, what are some things that you've noticed with the misinformation in the in the pandemic in the last 9 months, but also what you saw from bad actors exploiting the election, and how you are sort of preparing for the anti-vax and medical misinformation onslaught?
Yeah, it's interesting to compare the COVID conspiracy theories and disinfo campaigns with other conspiracy theories. Like, we've been doing a project with RAND, with Bill Mosvino and Ted Thomas, where we've looked at 4 different conspiracy theories, COVID and anti-vax actually separately, and then white genocide, which is the notion that that Jews are plotting to dilute the white race, so that they can oppress the white race, and alien visitation, because we wanted one that wasn't antisocial, from the outset. And the goal of the project was to collect 150 posts and documents from social media, and then compare the linguistic markers to see what we can understand are the attributes and differences between them. And I went into this conspiracy research thinking, like, white genocide is at one end, because all the lone shooters who've left manifestos and have been motivated by race have mentioned it explicitly, so it's linked to violence. And then at the other end is like a whole host of like JFK assassination, or maybe even flat earth. And we've done a bunch of ethnographic and now technical research that has added a lot of nuance to our understanding of conspiracy theories. One being that there are people who believe in a white genocide, and I've like interviewed half a dozen of them face to face the end of last year, who aren't about to be mobilized. They just think that happened, but it's a passive belief that they have. They're not consumed by it. They can't tell you who it was, who's behind the scenes, who they want to take action against. And you have people, and we met some who are like flat earthers and believe in and can tell you exactly who it is, who's like from NASA, who's propagating the spherical worldview, and who against whom they want to take action. And you could get them to say that they'd use their gun against these people. And so I think the disinfo space and conspiracy theory space is is much less easy to categorize and plot on a harm spectrum. And looking at the conspiracy, the linguistic markers, it's interesting that the traditional anti-vax discourse is really focused on the public good of health and protecting children. And most of the COVID discourse is really like, it's evolutionarily very early in its, right, compared to these other conspiracy theories, very early in its development. And a lot of the discussion is like about the origin theory of COVID and trying to figure out like, what is the conspiracy theory we believe in about where this started or about the role of specific individuals. So I think there is like the COVID conspiracies, like someone made the analogy that 9/11 used to be that truth and movement was the gateway conspiracy theory to conspiracy belief for the masses, and that COVID represents what that is today. That actually believers in 9/11 trutherism are contracting and COVID is expanding, and like we're figuring out what the parameters of that are. So I think there's like a bigger picture around COVID disinformation that is going to be critical for us to understand and try to get ahead of. We don't want to be like behind the eight ball on that.
Can I ask on that point, is when you see something that's sort of at that's nascent like that, that's sort of at the earlier stage and isn't as developed, it doesn't have all the sort of the contours and maybe the hasn't broken itself up into different groups nearly as much. When it's fluid like that, does that make it more difficult from your perspective as a problem with, to sort of solve for and in, or is it actually, is it sort of easier when groups aren't as hardened in their beliefs and everything is a little more fluid? How should we be thinking about that?
I'm like interested in coming at it from a slightly different angle, and I'd say that's where the Jigsaw team is focused, which is it's both kind of a rigid system and potentially flawed to say that there are categories of disinformation that are harmful and categories of disinformation that are innocuous. Because there are things that we might think from the outside, well, flat earthers, for example, that's just, that's fine, that's their business. We don't need to be worried about it. And we might think that, every mention of anything to do with race or immigration or something is dangerous. And I think there's an opportunity for us to look at what are the attributes of discourse that might make something violent online or offline, or might pose other types of harm. And so things like a focus in the discourse on personal roles, like it's not just us versus them and a lot of stance taking, but I'm really interested in like saying who the them is and getting detailed about it. And then also this notion of like social distance, creating distance between the people that you're talking about. So I would love to get to a point where we don't have to say it's elections and COVID. Those are our two disinformation priorities for the next year. But actually we can say, we can anticipate when campaigns are starting to engage in like dangerous othering or other types of like rhetorical moves that mean that we may not want to promote that type of speech on our platforms.
Nathaniel, when you're thinking about some of the lessons of the past 9 months, watching COVID, watching it overlap with the election, watching all these different groups sort of move in and out here. I mean, what is it? How has that framed your thinking about where we're going, especially with the vaccine rollout?
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of lessons we can draw from the election and from the work on COVID over the last year. As you know, the platforms have done a lot of work in this space. Yasmin was talking about some of it. I think one of the most important things, though, is the taxonomy of the discussion. It's that we can't treat this all as one problem. If we're talking about conspiracy theories, that is different from sort of an influence operation that's being driven by a deceptive actor, although they may overlap. Mm-hmm. I also think in the world of conspiracy theories, you have some actors, often who are at the core, are starting these things, who may be spreading false information knowingly in an effort to drive the public debate. Often they're grifters who are maybe looking to make money off of people who are looking for answers. And then you have a large community of people who don't realize the information is false and are engaging with the content taking it at face value. And what's important is I think each of those is a different challenge. They're all related and they're all part of this broader issue. But if you treat them all the same, you basically develop one hammer and they're not all the same shaped nail. So for example, I mean, a simple example of this, from March to October of this year, we removed about 12 million pieces of content on Facebook and Instagram for misinformation that could lead to physical harm, particularly around COVID. During the same period, we displayed warning labels on about 167 million pieces of content that didn't reach the level of posing imminent physical harm, but were misinformation about COVID. And what's interesting, and yes, that was my cat again. What's interesting is that in April, we looked at the impact of some of those labels, and we found that 95% of people who saw one of those warning labels during the month of April didn't click through to read the content that it was on. And so you end up, when you're dealing with this problem, I think you need a range of different solutions. You need ways to tackle the actors that are intentionally and deceptively pushing these narratives for financial gain. You need ways to tackle the actors that are doing this for political motivation, because they're going to be disincentivized differently. And then you need ways to tackle the content itself. But I do think it's important to recognize, because we're focused pretty heavily on the content here, the content discussion, what's true, what's false, where the lines are, these are, I think, some of the hardest questions embedded in this entire problem, where the boundary is between content that's going to accelerate violence or won't. What are the lines that we as a society should draw around where you can say and what you can say and how it should be amplified? If you're looking just at the content, I think you're in a very, very hard piece of the puzzle. Looking at the behavior of these actors is a really important balance to that. And then the last thing that I would note is, I do think, I think, Joan, you mentioned sort of public debate is sort of an unregulated space, particularly on the platforms. I think one of the most important things we need as we go forward is regulation. I think we need a regulatory framework for these discussions. There are a lot of hard questions here that the boundaries that we're drawing should really be informed by the politically elected government. And we should have constraints on the platforms that we're implementing, as opposed to us building the rules as best as we can and then trying to iterate on them. And I think one of the really interesting opportunities we have going forward is to take some of the lessons from the election, take some of the lessons from dealing with COVID over the last year, when you really did see across the community a whole bunch of people pull together to tackle this, and ask, how do we institutionalize those lessons? And some of that might be regulation, some of it might be legislation, some of it might be coordinated frameworks. I think there will be a number of different things that will come out of it. But we really need, I think, moving to that structure is going to make a big difference in terms of the trust in the decisions and the trust in the actions, which is pretty important when you're particularly thinking about labeling things, and particularly thinking about putting information out there. You need people to trust who it's coming from and where it's coming from and why it's happening.
You know, to that end, talking a little bit about different frameworks, about different intervention solutions, whatever you want to call it. Apparently, my internet connection is unstable, so whatever that means. If you can hear me, if I drop out or anything, let me know.
You're back. We can hear you.
I love you're unstable. Zoom telling me that, as if I didn't know already. Okay, so
you
when
don't need a therapist, right?
It's just Zoom.
You're unstable.
It's fantastic. So to this end, Joan, I've seen you tweeting some recently about the rumor control page on CISA and how it's like, one of the most important web pages on the internet. As we move towards this idea of in a Biden administration, in a federal government that wants to take this a little bit more seriously, that wants to sort of institutionalize some of these practices. I mean, I'm curious, using that page, Joan, as a maybe a bare minimum starting point. Like, what are you thinking about in terms of what the government can do here from an institutional standpoint? Is it just things like rumor control and having basic spaces that people can access that have the seal next to it that you can maybe have a little trust, or how's your thinking on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the things that we knew early on is that if journalists were going to be able to take action on some information, they were going to need, to have more than just platforms stepping in saying, this is what we took action on. The rumor control idea is basically, you have this government agency whose job it is to communicate about election security as well as other security issues. And so in the face of knowing that there was going to be a lot of different rumors circulating, and we're going to have this very compressed public sphere where a lot of people were going to be online, it seemed rather important to have a place where some authoritative source were going to be able to say, we acknowledge that this rumor is circulating, and here is, our take on what the evidence should look like. The hard part about that is when we move into scientific information, you'd think things would get clearer, but they also become much more murky in the sense that science takes a long time to develop. There's lots of debate. And one of the things that we've been looking at as a research team is actually trying to look very deeply at, those who are putting out preprints or scientific information quickly. Well, what about the openness of that? Just like the openness of social media could be leveraged by disinformers. And then what agencies would be the right ones to try to step in and clarify some of that, or not even just government agencies, but also potentially scientific professional associations. And so I think that that's really important, that we have these kinds of spaces where more authoritative and more accurate information can circulate, because by and large, I do think we have a distribution problem. I often say that truth needs an advocate, and it's because truth doesn't really have an influencer, right? Like there's just not a lot of people out there that is like, hey, sky's still blue, right? And so, but when it comes to regulation, and I've been in Congress a few times this year talking about misinformation. It's a really thorny, sticky issue around particularly the policies that are in place, and then lots of like, well, what happens if, some regulation goes awry and we don't know how to undo it? Sort of like the situation that we're in right now with protections under 230. It's like if something were to destabilize that, what might happen? And so the regulation question, I don't know if it actually comes from the American government. I think that we're going to get regulation in other countries that are then going to shape the technology that is then malleable in the sense that, or flexible, which will then be the kind of technology that would kind of blanket the earth. And so from my perspective, I'm still very, very skeptical about what regulation might look like, but I am fairly hopeful that if we can get some scientific associations, as well as some really smart folks that are already being included in the COVID task force, as well as I think we need misinformation people on the COVID task force, that we can deal with this problem as it happens and iterate as we learn about what are really going to be the big flaws of misinformation, medical misinformation, as it scales, even if it's just the kind of stuff that Yasmin was talking about, that are just ideas about where this came from, right? How does that then trigger in people's minds ideas about what their real risk is, or what the possibilities for mitigation of COVID-19 are, if you're already believing that it comes from this odorous bioweapon space? Then the idea that a vaccine is somehow going to fix it maybe doesn't resonate with you. And so we do have to consider all of these things as connected. And unfortunately, I often view technology as a process, not a product. I don't know if there's any, world beyond this. I do think that we will increasingly move towards standardization of practices. And my hope is that we don't do any unneeded damage in the process.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a great point, especially talking about the preprint stuff. I mean, a real problem I noticed even for myself as an information just consumer was this string of seemingly scientific, like seemingly you read it and you're like, oh, that sounds right. And everyone has doctor after their name, and they come from institutions in academia that I've been told to trust. And yet,
you can't trust all of us. You can trust me, but you can't.
and yet at the
Don't
same
trust
time,
anyone at Stanford. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. No, I'm not. No, I'm not. Yeah. Okay.
This is great. Now we're just seeding our own disinformation in the universe. No, I think it's really true that it is so difficult because the science is happening so quickly, and because people are just trying to get things out there to put their foot in the door and plant their flag in the ground. And it's incredibly difficult in that way. We have about like 4 more minutes, and something I wanted to address. It's a little bit tangential, but I think since I have you all in this room, I do want to talk about it. It's starting with Yasmin, which is that something I'm quite worried about is the effect of this pandemic on radicalization, on entrenchment into these toxic information spaces, people losing jobs, people being stuck at home. We've seen reporting suggesting the link between this type of behavior, QAnon growth, anti-vax growth, just general misinformation, general trolling, abusive behavior. And Yasmin, Jigsaw has done a lot of work in this space, and I'm just curious. This is sort of my standard question, but like, this is a problem. I think it's probably getting worse. It's going to continue for a while. How are you all thinking about trying to combat this? Is this something we just have to sort of live with, or are there ways you're thinking we can make this, we can ameliorate this a little bit in the months to come?
Is this the impact on radicalization, accelerating effect on radicalization?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I'm going to make this really short because Joan is the world expert on this topic. But we did actually publish something just today, so I appreciate the plug. Check it out on jigsaw.google.com, which is our research from on the topic of violent white supremacy, and based on interviews with experts like Joan, but also interviews with 36 former violent extremists and people who've recently come out of movements like Atom Orphan Division and the Base. And we are definitely hearing corroborating testimonies to what you just said, Charlie, which is that the environment makes recruitment and radicalization fertile, or it's fertile for recruitment and radicalization. The way that we've tried to approach it is by trying to change the discourse around the problem of white supremacist radicalization. It's very dangerous, growing, the #1 VE threat in this country. And what we've done is highlight stories of how people have left in the hope that maybe those will connect to people who are considering leaving movements. Jen probably has much more to share on that.
I mean, yeah, I won't take up too much time, but I do think that as we deal with these questions, we also have to deal with the fact that it's not just, the content that's at stake here. There are real people and real people's lives, and the ways in which people get drawn in are often through charismatic individuals who have an agenda, right? And part of the way that they reach into people's telephones is through these platforms. And sometimes they really target people who are in crisis. They target people who have unsavory questions that they want to know more about, race politics in the United States, and they don't know who to turn to, and they end up in these spaces. And that these groups are very receptive to those kinds of questions. And so I think part of it has to do with the fact that we're in a very divisive, hyper-polarized moment where, I teach at Harvard Kennedy School. Everybody's got a political position. Nobody wants to tell you if they're a Republican or a Democrat. Everybody's afraid. And so in these moments when we have these sort of hyper-polarized groups and audiences, people do turn to the internet for answers. And we have to be really sure that when they're seeking information, that they're not drawn into these different groups and drawn in by this kind of content that can be really, really powerful and mobilizing. And as I've spent, Yasmin's come to my office and seen some of the stuff that we've seen, and some of it is it's in plain sight, and lots of folks, end up seeing it by virtue of being interested in other things. But I do think now that platform companies are much more receptive to studying it and, you know, taking up the call to take action on it, unfortunately, it's going to take a really long time to figure out how to do that. But if we were having this conversation in 2017, it would be literally off the table. We wouldn't be talking about platform companies taking action on any of it. And so I do see that we have made incredible progress in this short span of time. And I'm just hoping that we can continue, especially as we deal with problems of racism and hate groups online.
I unfortunately have to leave us there, I believe. I could legitimately talk with you all for 6 hours and in some cases have before. So thank you all again. Sorry if this was a little disjointed. There's so much to get to, but I really appreciate it and appreciate everything that you all do for you know, the greater good of our information systems and even just like you said, I think a big takeaway from this right now is that there have, regardless of all that, you know, all the bad stuff that's out there, the leaps and bounds that we've made in awareness, in, you know, amount of resources directed towards this problem, it's due in part to, you know, all of your efforts. So thank you for that. Thank you all for coming and listening. We will hopefully do this again sometime soon, all in person and in Aspen. So thank you all very much, and thanks to Nathaniel's cat for finally showing up, doing all of that. I think I just hit the red button and leave, but
you know, you got to say there's more coming up next.
Oh yeah, there's more coming up next. There's a panel, the realpolitik of supply chains. So yeah, stick around for more from Aspen Cyber. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us for the 5th annual Aspen Cyber Summit. I'm Mai Sisla, the Deputy Director of the Aspen Tech Policy Hub, a Bay Area-based incubator at the Aspen Institute training technologists on how to do policy. I'm pleased to introduce our next session. Before we go on, feel free to check the full summit agenda and bios of all of our speakers at aspencybersummit.org. I also want to thank FireEye, Intel, and Proofpoint for making this week's summit possible and helping us convene such an important set of conversations in such a complicated year. We would also like to acknowledge Blue Vector, SIGPA-NA, and the American Gas Association for their additional support. I'm pleased now to turn it over to David Sanger of the New York Times, who will be leading a discussion on the supply chain and emerging technology cyber threats, a subject he's explored in his best-selling book, The Perfect Weapon, and a recent HBO documentary. David, over to you.
Thanks very much, Maya, and thank you all for joining with us on this panel. We've got a great group for you here, and I just want to go about introducing them as they pop up on the screen. For this discussion of supply chains, a subject that normally might make most Washington politicians flee until you sort of reframe it as the central core of the US-China competition and competition with others, which is what we're hoping to go explain today. We have with us Samantha Ravitch from the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, who, of course, was on the Cyber Solarium Commission, still is, which dealt with this topic at great length and with great clarity, I'm glad to say. Joachim Reiter has joined us from Vodafone and is going to talk a little bit about 5G and Huawei and how the US approach to trying to get European countries to ban Huawei, sometimes by threat of cutting them off from intelligence, has resounded in Europe, but we'll also be talking to them about the broader issues. Claire Vishik from Intel, the great chip maker, is sitting right at the midst of all of this, because Intel has discovered how difficult it is frequently to go untangle many of these issues. And Diane Rinaldo was the former acting administrator at NTIA, and has been working on the Open Radio Access Network, or ORAN, another acronym that would send many Washingtonians fleeing. And that's an effort to go try to get us out of this dependency on Huawei and other such networks by developing an alternative that makes it a lot easier to put together a network with basically open source software. So we're going to be looking forward to Diane walking us through this. Samantha, wonderful to be back with you, and an old friend. And I'm wondering if you could just try to frame this for us. When your report white paper came out, it identified the supply chains as a really critical element of this. In fact, said at one point, put bluntly, in the context of our supply chains for ICT, the United States has a China problem. Over the past 2 decades, China has mobilized state-owned and state-influenced companies to grab a dominant position in markets for several emerging technologies, including for telecommunications equipment. This is no accident, but the result of a concerted strategic effort by the Chinese government to capture these markets through a mix of government-led industrial policy, unfair and deceptive trade practices, including state-led intellectual property theft, and the manipulation of international standards. And you went on at some length. So tell us for a moment, how did we get to this spot? And weren't we the country that was making all this stuff for the supply chain to begin with a few years ago?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you. And David, it's always a pleasure to see you. You're right. We kind of woke up recently, well, some of us maybe earlier, and realized all the things that we thought we had been making for ourselves, that our economy rested upon, that our military rested upon, our safety, our health. A lot of it is actually now made by adversaries and are in supply chains that we may not be able to trust, right? So just putting it in kind of a more general context, and let me say, this is how we talked about it at the Solarium Commission. So for those of you who haven't looked at a report, www.solarium.gov. We had 4 members of Congress on the commission, and 6 outsiders, of whom I was one. We met 30 times over the last year, 2 hours every time. And we really talked about the hard issues that we're all facing in clear, practical terms, led by our 2 wonderful co-chairs, Senator Angus King and Representative Mike Gallagher, right? So you wake up in the morning, you turn on the lights, you expect the lights to go on, right? You don't think about what is in the supply chain of our bulk power, right? Where are our transformers coming from? You turn on the water, you expect the water to come out. You don't think about the 70,000 water utilities in the United States and where are they getting all of their IT and OT software, right? Your food supply, your medical supply, and then take it to, of course, the military, right? What makes our planes fly? What makes our ships sail? Our satellites to see? Where are the pieces, the components coming from? Can we trust them? Are they real? Are they counterfeit? Do they have open vulnerabilities where malicious software can get in and bring down our planes, our ships, our satellites? That's the way we kind of framed the problem. And it's a huge problem, right? And the solutions are not easy and they're not obvious, but we have to start to take steps towards them. And one of the things that the Solarium focused on, the commission focused on, is to help the thinking move forward on prioritizing what pieces in our supply chain are A, most important, and B, most vulnerable, and C, can we create the minimum viable manufacturing capacity in the United States or an ally nation to substitute for where adversaries or others, untrustworthy partners, may be putting things into our supply chain. So let me just say one more word and then hand it back to you, David. The Cyberspace Solarium Commission came out with its full recommendations, and we shall see. What's going to be in the National Defense Authorization Act that should be happening hopefully very soon. We believe that there'll be, or I believe there may be up to 20, maybe even more of our recommendations that are in the NDAA. And many of the ones that are in there focus on helping the US government prioritize how to deal with the supply chain threat. Things like the National Cyber Director, things like continuity of the economy planning. So it helps to identify key component products that are critical for our national and economic security. Right? Leverage instruments of capitalism in our markets to ensure minimum viable manufacturing capacity. How do we work with private and public partners and ensure competitiveness? Because as you said, David, there are those actors, specifically China, that are completely undermining our economic wherewithal in this space. So over the next year, a number of the specific supply chain recommendations out of the Commission will also be pushed forward, hopefully into next year's NDAA, the ones that don't get in this year. But we can talk at length about specifics, but that hopefully sets some of the table.
Thank you very much for that, Samantha. One quick question for you along the way. So when you read the Solarium Commission report, and it's lengthy, so pour a drink and settle in with it. It focuses a lot, as you say, on building these alternatives, which we're going to ask Joachim about in just a moment. But during the Trump administration, what we saw more of were the sanctions to try to wall off Huawei and some of these other suppliers. In fact, there were some that came just in the past few days against Chinese semiconductor manufacturers and so forth. How would you assess, where are we in this process? We've seen a lot of walling off. How much in the past 4 years do we see the buildup of this capacity for alternatives that you describe?
I think probably more, obviously, much more needs to be done, on the latter. But in the Commission itself, we realized there had to be a shock to the system. We realized that it's such a large topic. It is every piece of our infrastructure that I don't think there was a lot of pushback to the general notion of things like the executive bulk power order. Right now, the details of how do you go about ripping and replacing large parts of our, bulk power grid system, because the parts may have been provided, sold to us by adversaries, gets a little trickier. Who pays? At what pacing? What is the next one down? Do we even have the capability? Which we don't right now. Right. So it is, as you said, the second part has to be increased at a significant velocity.
So Joachim, as you look at this, particularly from Vodafone's perspective and from Europeans' perspective, and you think about how the Trump administration went about dealing with the Huawei problem. I traveled with Secretary Pompeo when he took that big trip through Europe, and he basically went country to country, and he said, here's your choice. You can unsign Huawei or refuse to sign up, or you can kiss goodbye to US intelligence. And as you can imagine, there was a bit of a reaction, a negative reaction to being presented with that ultimatum. But what's happened in the past 6 months or so is I think I've detected a bit of a change in Europe. The British, having done a sort of halfway measure, then suddenly did a bigger ban. It's still being debated in Germany. Tell us a little bit about what worked and what didn't in the Trump administration's approach as we think about handing this problem to a new administration.
First to say, I like the lot what Samantha said. I mean, I think frankly, telco is sort of the first guinea pig between Western allied countries on how do you address the fundamental questions around supply chain. Vodafone's and much of Europe's starting point is not really about this being the problem of the supply chain being global. Actually, the problem is a different one, and which is the reason why it becomes so intractable. The problem with the supply chain is way too narrow and it lacks optionality. And when a supply chain is narrow and lacks optionality, you can make a point around security, but you're then faced with a resilience problem as a result of the security measures you take, which for critical national infrastructure is absolutely essential. No point in having something where the equipment in the network is secure, but the whole network is not resilient anymore. So I think for Europe, that has been the big conundrum. How do you move up on your security objectives, which Europe shares, while at the same time try to address the resilience effects it will have for the network? And the bottom line, the real problem here is we've been all sleeping at the wheels, ending up in a situation where China dominates more than 50% of the supply chain within telco equipment. And operators have been complaining around this for a long time, saying, guys, the collapse of the vendor space, as we call it, is not healthy. It will not lead to a good situation. I think that for me, the real point I want to land is US have approached this directly as a tactical issue. And that's where you get into a zero-sum game between what you call in the title openness innovation or global value chains versus geopolitics. I don't detect any different point of view in a European context with respect to its concerns around China or its concerns around China dominance in technology. But Europe cannot handle a tactical choice because A, it's not a tactical question, but more importantly, it's in a conundrum where it doesn't have 4 to 6 or whatever percent you have in rural carriers of Huawei equipment. It has 30, 40%, sometimes much more. Some networks are at 100% Huawei in certain member states. So rip and replace is like doing open heart surgery on your existing 4G network where you run the risk of losing 3G and 4G signal just for the purposes of creating a more robust 5G network. And that was basically, that's still the big question. And in actual fact, the US itself is really trying to deal with that problem. So yes, the direction is clear, but the rural carriers have not been requested to do the rip and replace just yet. They haven't really started. You're still having discussions in Congress on the compensation, much of which is what Europe starts now. So from a Vodafone point of view, where I've engaged extensively with the US government, but we're also engaging, of course, in Europe. And what we have pointed to is that actually from an industry point of view, and this is not a Vodafone view, there is a way forward, provided we take a strategic look at it, not a tactical one. And that would imply, number one, we absolutely cannot lose against China on 5G use cases. And use cases are driven by the availability of 5G. So Internet of Things, mobile private networks, all the things that will drive our competitiveness. So agree, US has been pushing this really well. Europe has been way too slow in its 5G deployment. Secondly, that needs to be underpinned by a strategy to drive supply diversity. And that's basically where Open RAN and what Diana will talk about, but something that Vodafone is deploying at scale now, including in Europe. Third, that needs to be underpinned by a broader ambition to protect society. Because as an operator, I don't trust anyone. My starting point for anyone I collaborate with, no matter whether it's Microsoft or Amazon for my cloud solutions in the edge, or whether it's Huawei or Cisco or Intel, in whatever formation, I have a legal obligation to never trust anyone and to make sure that my network is safe. Which basically means that my starting point is, how do I build robust systems? And this is where we have to realize what we're dealing with telco is just the beginning of what we will deal with Internet of Things and everything else, which is the softwareization of our economy, where we don't have the robust systems, risk-based systems, to have standards and certification to ensure that the software that we deploy is safe. And then finally is basically the big unknown today is we got to this security standing partly because we didn't have economic policies that underpinned it. In Europe, there is a reason why security has been deprioritized, which is basically that all policymakers only had one objective, which was maximizing price deflation. Well, you get what you pay for. So if you want security, which is a quality measurement, what is the regulatory economic policies that you need to have in place to underpin the investment in security? And that's the question, which is still sort of everyone wants to park on the side. But that was the thing that drove Ericsson and Nokia to actually make far more money in the United States and China than what they make in Europe. So that's why you see Ericsson being very critical of the Swedish decision on banning Huawei because it's fearful of retaliation in China, because it makes more money in China than it does in Europe, despite Europe being a massive market, because no one makes money in Europe. So you have to understand how a supply chain works.
Let me just take you from this very good explanation of how the supply chain works to the sort of bigger geopolitical question that came out of here. So earlier this year, we heard Attorney General Barr, of all people, sort of not sort of the one you would normally think of as being in charge of industrial policy in the United States, make a proposal saying, look, the only way out of this, if we're going to go build this, is if we can get Ericsson and Nokia and other European members sort of join up with a significant US maker, including a semiconductor maker, and we'll ask Claire about this in a bit. Intel's name was kicked around, but not the only one kicked around, to basically build a Western consortium, something you can't imagine Attorney General Barr's party, thinking of 20, 25 years ago when they were railing against industrial policy, if we're going to be able to go face this. The European reaction, as I heard it, was like, yeah, right. This is just what Europe's going to go do. Sign up for some American behemoth who will basically absorb our companies and take off. How did this idea land in Europe? What did people think of it? And what do you think its future is in the next couple of years?
I think one of the things that we have discussed a lot with the US administration, US needs to be very, very careful about certain things. Protectionism and intrusive industrial policy has a far more long-standing tradition in Europe than it has in the United States.
Yes.
And the security stance of the United States has inflated demands inside Europe for what they call technology sovereignty and strategic autonomy, which, by the way, is not only against China, it's also against the US. So be very careful for what you wish for. When you cross a line, we'll move away from arguing for facilitating market solutions to politically engineering consortiums. When you cross that line, actually, you're just inflating a bunch of traditionalists that exist in a number of other continents to do the same thing. But they're not going to do it in favor of US interests. They're going to do it against US interests just as much as against Chinese interests. So we're a big supporter as Vodafone of building the consortia needed to have a successful Open RAN deployment. We're really keen to get Ericsson and Nokia on board. We're working with all players in the market, together with a number of US Open RAN players. That's a market-driven consortia establishment. When politicians start to act God in the marketplace, first, US is not doing it really well, but more importantly, it legitimizes everyone else to do the same. And by the way, they're world champions in this in other continents.
Good point. Diane, Joachim has driven this right down your alleyway here. You've been spending a good deal of time trying to come up with an alternative. Wonderfully named ORAN, is that how you will normally pronounce it?
Our coalition is the Open RAN Policy Coalition, which I've been told that it's a mouthful. So ORAN seems to be the nickname.
You guys may need to get back to the acronym doctors and see what you can do on that. But explain how Open RAN is going to be an alternative to this. And also deal with the critique that, yeah, it's a great idea, but it's going to be a number of years before this is all together. And in the meantime, Huawei is going to be out there building market share that nobody is going to be willing to go rip out by the time you come along.
Great. No, I appreciate the opportunity to be with you all today. So I started working with the coalition in March. We launched in May with 31 companies, and today we sit at 57 companies that spanned the globe in the mobile ecosystem. Our message has resonated well with policymakers around the world because we have a positive message about how can we solve this problem? How can we ensure a more robust and diversified supply chain? And what we're talking when you talk about Open RAN, and at the coalition, as you can imagine, with 57 companies, we stay pretty high level. We are talking about standardizing the interfaces between the subcomponent parts. Now that's the radio, that's the software, that's the hardware. And if you're able to standardize the interfaces, it allows for more of a plug and play model that you can build a network. So I liken it to the old stereo system that I got in the 80s from my parents, where it all you plugged together in the back, and if something broke, if I wanted to exchange a part, I couldn't. To the stereo systems that we have today, where you can bring in different component parts, or you can eventually just stream in Spotify, similar to the telecom networks that we have. And what we've seen is a lack of VC money in the telecom industry because it has been a closed system. If you have a great idea for a radio, it's going to be really hard. You only have 5 companies that you can go to sell that radio. And there's a 10-year life cycle on these parts. So, the barrier to entry has been too high. So if you're able to standardize, you're going to drive competition. You're going to allow a lot of these Silicon Valley types engineers to start thinking of new ways to invent radio software to perform, in the best that you're going to be able to do for a network. Whether you're building the network in New York City or my small hometown of Rumford, Maine, you want a network that's going to be best for your customers. So I think in our conversation with international policymakers, the message has definitely resonated because nobody wants to go with Huawei. But first and foremost, in my conversation, NTIA and my conversations now, it's cost. If you're talking between picking Huawei or picking somebody else, that could mean the difference between being in the black and being in the red. And if you're going to drive competition, you're going to spur innovation, you're going to bring down the price at the end of the day. So that aspect is also very appealing to people. And no longer will we have these 10-year life cycles. You'll be able to update networks as we move forward. So in 4 years, you decide you want a new radio, you can exchange that part out for something new. So it's going to really change how we look at the Gs. So we will have a 6G moving forward, but it's going to be more of an iterative approach to technology as we can do updates through software and the exchange of component parts.
But would this essentially work, Diane, in the future, if this was successful? You would essentially have a white box that could be from any different manufacturer, and then you would have the software built in. So the idea is that the proprietary switches that Huawei or that its competitors in Europe building would basically over time kind of wither because you had an all software solution?
That's right. And it just allows it to, you're allowed to customize your network better. So whether you're using software, choosing a radio, you're able to build the network that's best suited for your particular needs at that time.
And has Huawei joined your 57 companies?
No, they do not belong. They and they also do not participate in the O-RAN Alliance. They have a closed proprietary system, and they have not expressed interest in going into an open RAN format.
Have they expressed opposition?
We have not heard from them.
Okay. Claire, thank you for your patience as we've been walking through all of this. So in Intel, we've got a company that is both a national champion for the United States, a global producer, one that is as dependent on this complex supply chain as any company on earth, and yet which American officials frequently cite as the solution, the way out of this. So tell us how this looks from inside Intel.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Great question, but I want to mention immediately that this problem, the supply chain trustworthiness that we're discussing now, is much bigger than one company, one country, one industry sector. I would like to build on what Joachim, Diane, and Samantha said before. I think the main problem that we are experiencing is that there are at least 3 distinct areas that are fundamental to the solution, but that operate in isolation. Without moving all these pieces together where they are at least understood by the stakeholders, if not integrated, we cannot achieve a good result. Think about a few examples. You cannot provide sophisticated video services if you don't have sufficient bandwidth. You cannot formulate a great higher education strategy if you don't have a K-12 education system in place. It's a little bit similar for the supply chain. There are at least 3 components that I can see there. One of them is the trade system. The global trade system is ancient. I believe the first trade agreements and restrictions have been evidenced as far away as the ancient Egypt. This system has evolved, but it's not evolving fast enough, not on par with the technology to help realize the potential of having adequate rules, harmonization of these rules, and understanding of the consequences of these rules. The second area that Joachim mentioned also is economics. It's impossible to implement supply chain visions in the current environment when you don't understand and combine with the trade rules the economic consequences of the things that you do, both short-term, long-term, both for one company, one country, one region, and globally. These 2 areas of thought have been very active. You have a lot of literature, a lot of government activity, a lot of policies connected with trade. You talk a lot about economics, especially in conjunction with today's conundrums such as 5G. But it's not very common that you talk about these 2 areas together. Finally, there is technology. As a technologist, it's the easiest area for me to talk about. What we have now is a completely different supply chain, different than it was even 20 years ago. In Europe, in research and funding, supply chains are frequently considered as cyber-physical systems. This is because even though we move physical goods, we move them through the use of electronic channels for ordering, for monitoring, for configuring, and so on. And cyber-physical systems and the vision of their trustworthiness is much more complex. It's not just security. It's not just security and robustness. It's a lot more. It's probably security, privacy, safety, reliability, resilience, robustness, all of which need to be considered together. Now we have a lot of technologies, that are treated completely separately from the supply chain, that answer those questions, that deal with safety, that deal with privacy, that deal with some areas of security, especially integrity, like trusted computing or even blockchain and distributed ledger in some situations. But supply chain seems to exist completely separately from them. What we use in supply chain is a list of rules and approaches that have existed for decades and perhaps 100 years. This needs to be changed. We need to learn how to incorporate at least the integrity parameters that have been developed for ICT into the supply chain organically. Is this going to create trust that we need in the supply chain? Certainly not by itself, but it will help a lot because it will create a lot of the situations where you have evidence of your actions, or you have provable evidence that is submitted either cryptographically or through other means that can help make a determination of how your supply chain is working, how your component has been moving through the supply chain, how your system has been designed. There are very interesting projects that are beginning to emerge to combine supply chain ideas and technology ideas together. One of them is driven by Brookings and Lawfare. Intel has something that's called compute lifecycle assurance that works along the same lines, but it is just the beginning. So I think when we learn how to incorporate technology to provide some of the evidence in the supply chain, When we learn to understand the economics of our decisions and be more flexible with trade rules, we will be halfway through to where it will not be a situation where a country of origin is everything. One company determines how we treat all the other companies. One product is not trusted because of an event 20 years ago. We will have evidence of what is happening, and evidence is a foundation of, harmonized, interoperable technology development. It leads to standards. It leads to mutual understanding.
Well, thank you, Claire. That was great. A question for Samantha and Joachim and Diane as well, or anybody who wants to dive in. But let's start with Samantha on this. Right now, almost all the supply chain issues we've been discussing have basically been hardware ones, right? Are you going to buy the Huawei system? Are you going to rely on Chinese undersea cable? Are you going to pick up those networks? Is Claire and Intel going to be relying on certain foundry or other technologies coming from in hardware form? But increasingly, this is a software problem as well. And, that sort of burst upon Americans with the TikTok dispute earlier this year. For the first time, we had the United States seeking to bar a completely software product out of China, an app that was already on 100 million US cell phones, mostly on the cell phones of our teenagers, but not exclusively on our teenagers. And it raised the question, once you've got this on your cell phone and the app gets updated every week or 2 or 3, and you've got the kind of surveillance of your activity that takes place through the app, because the way TikTok operates, it's by watching your preferences. That seemed to spread the whole supply chain issue into new territory and create some new vulnerabilities, and made people sort of think about it, including some at the White House for the very first time. Samantha, you want to sort of walk us through that? Because I know it's an issue the Solarium discussed at various moments.
Well, yeah, although I kind of would push back that it was, TikTok that made us all aware of the vulnerabilities in the software supply chain.
Aware of it. Yeah.
Right. Although I would say, and not that anyone suggested there was malicious code or anything in Boeing Supermax, but I like that example because, it had over 10 million lines of code, millions, tens of millions of lines of code from developers all around the world, putting together into a system that, then, people flying the airplanes. There was a problem with some of that. Nothing had to do with malicious code and being inserted in it. But I mean, that I think drives home a point, I think, better than, TikTok. Granted that there was concerns on that as well. So a couple things. One is there's getting to be between hardware and software, a lot less of distance, right, between these two, especially as I focused, I'm also on the Secretary of Energy's advisory board. And, as we look at grid reliability and water infrastructure reliability, it used to be the phrase that OT and IT, they drank at different bars, right? Well, not so much anymore. So that is one thing I have to say. But in terms of what you're getting at, David, is how do we get our arms around this problem? How do we get our arms around who is making the software, who's writing the code, how is it being farmed out, to a couple developers in Vietnam, and somewhere in Europe, somewhere in Latin America, all getting together on a platform to write our code. Who are they? What are they writing? Are we secure? Are we sure about the code that they're inputting? It is almost too much to bear, right? It is, you start to try to focus on it. And that's why people, if their eyes aren't rolling back in their head, they're putting their hands, they're putting their head down on the table. But I love where Claire was going with this, because there, two things. One, there are new ways to think through and understand what is in your supply chain, what pieces of code are going into what systems, things such as secure ledgers and blockchain, to be able to figure out who's writing what in a piece of software. Right, there are real discoveries, innovations that are coming out there. It is not the black box and the black hole that we can't get our arms around. And so, I really do think that some new things are coming down the pike on that. But the second piece goes to what Joachim had mentioned, and we did focus on this at the Solarium as well. We need to, if this is a word, decomplexify. Is that a word?
It is now.
It is now, right? All right, I'm going to patent it. We have chosen to make things so complicated and build in vulnerabilities, right? Do we need everything to go as fast? Do we need to be, as Joachim had said, the cheapest? But the complexity is killing us. And so there's too many decision makers that are now out of the loop on deciding, can I buy this piece of software or that piece of software? They don't even know what's in it. They have no visibility. And this goes for, that little old lady in Peoria has no idea whether she can buy X or Y, what's more secure. We focused on this in the Solarium. We need more things like underwriter labs. We need test beds so that average citizens can know what is more secure in the phone that they're using, or their router. They have no idea. I have no idea. My mom certainly has no idea. But for the decision makers who are doing acquisition at the Pentagon as well. So that was a long-winded way around, to hopefully answering, part of your question, that it does the software supply chain does not need to be as complex as it is, and we cannot allow it to continue to be as such, because we are literally buying vulnerabilities for ourselves.
Great,
David, if I may?
I'm gonna turn to you, but I want to make the question more complicated by adding in two questions we've gotten from our audience. And by the way, for those listening in, there is a Q&A function. And while I'm sure we won't get to everything, we'll try to get to some. The first two that came in, Joachim, are actually for you, and they get to this point. One of them asks, since Vodafone has defended the use of Huawei in its networks, saying that you could control the security risk by, keeping Huawei out of the core systems and using it in the radio access network. The question is, do you really still believe that? Can you go forward with Huawei knowing that it's a security risk, and knowing what Samantha just said about, trying to keep track of constantly updated millions of lines of code? It's not just the Macs that has got that complex amount. And what have you discovered about Huawei and security risks there that lead you in a very different place to where so many different countries and intelligence agencies have sort of warned of?
I'm not sorry. I think that's the last twist of the question. I don't agree with David. We're UK headquartered, right? So we have spent 10 years with the UK intelligence service to go through line by line of the Huawei code. UK has run a test center for the last 10 years where they had to submit any product that is launched in the UK market, and we go through together with the operators, together with the intelligence community, the entire kit. And it's all software. It's not a hardware. Huawei is not a hardware question. It's a software question. That's where you have the questions around, can they snoop? Can they have a kill switch and the rest of it?
Yeah.
It's in the software, right? And that's why the UK built the capability for the last 10 years. That's why UK, by the way, argued for risk-based approach, because it basically had come to the conclusion. It's also why the UK intelligence community came out with identifying software vulnerabilities while recognizing they're only looking at Huawei. We had a 7-year blackout by a competitor here in the UK because of software vulnerability of another vendor. So it goes to the point you can have software that are inaccurate or not good enough, basically, for running resilient networks, which is a concern we have with a lot of vendors, and that's why we're scrutinizing. Vodafone does 3 separate software tests over and above what we do with the UK government. So it's not like we're sleepwalking, we haven't done anything. What you're seeing now is national security agencies waking up, particularly in Europe, for things that we as an operator have been doing for a very long time. And we welcome them to the club because we actually, and that's why, by the way, we argue that we need to have that type of capabilities in Europe for all vendors. It's just simply too important, the type of network you put in, to not have any controls or any checks of the software going into it. But my point is, guess what? The braking system of a Tesla is not determined by the hardware, it's determined by the software. So you're going to have the same questions being, now that we have on network equipment, being spread to all aspects of any connected product in the future, any product that is running on its functionality based on software. And that's why we, from a Vodafone point of view, said, well, hang on a second, our learning from network equipment that we've done for 10 years, looking at software, testing its robustness, testing its resilience, looking for software glitches, we're now deploying into our IoT framework, where we have a global platform, because that's the next thing. And we're arguing that governments need to quickly build their governance systems to have the capability of checking whether software is safe. I don't use the word security, I use the word safe, because the reality is that we have a full governance system. Every country runs a governance system today to check whether a car is safe, but only for the hardware. When the car is being determined by software, its acceleration, whether you can hack into it, whether you can brake in 60 meters instead of 40 meters or instead of 120 meters, which sort of determines whether pedestrian die, that is no longer determined by the hardware, it's determined by the software. Guess what? Your type approval authorities don't have the capability to check that. I don't think that's a satisfying answer for modern economies when we have a responsibility as governments to protect citizens. It's not a satisfying answer for corporate either. So that's why we're pushing so hard that we need to come together and close this governance gap in the software space. And that goes to Samantha's point and also some of the point made with Claire. So
thank Joachim for making us feel so good about getting into our self-driving cars in the next few years, completely without any run for this. So Diane, let me ask you this. So you've started together this alternative, an alliance, and having the companies together is a proven way to begin to get that going. But you could argue that the US is going to have to need to adjust its industrial policy, or really sort of create one. That's a politically charged word in Washington, although I would argue less politically charged than it was 10 or 15 years ago. So what is it that you would advise the Biden administration to do along that regard in order to speed this along? And tell me, while I know you're working on Open RAN right now, what other technologies, a good question for Claire as well, do you think we should be thinking about after we're done with this telecom question and so forth? And I'm going to ask you both to be pretty economical in your answers, because astoundingly, we are running up against our time.
Great. So if I was giving advice to the incoming administration, similar to what Samantha did in the Solarium report, I would suggest that he brings together the brightest minds in the business to have a conversation about these issues. And you really need to look at it holistically, where you can focus on a single issue, go down in the weeds, kind of figure out where the pain points are, what we need to do, but then pop up, see it at a 50,000 foot level and see if it works in practice. And I think that's really important. You need a whole government approach when you're talking about the supply chain. At the coalition, we focus narrowly on the radio access network. We're not trying to boil the ocean. Our message is simple. We need a robust, diverse supply chain, and we believe by standardizing the interfaces that you're going to allow for that competition to occur to ensure a supply not only for 5G but 6G and beyond. They were able to continue to have a secure and a robust network that's going to power, as they say, it's the digital of everything that we're moving to with IoT and smart cities and autonomous vehicles. So I think it's important that we have that peace of mind from a national security standpoint, of course, but also from an economic standpoint. It's not enough to take 2 players out of the market. You need to ensure that the market is healthy and robust as well.
And Claire, could you take up for us the question of what technologies we should be thinking about next that are going to have this problem?
Let me start with what technologies we should think about it next. This is an easy question. None of the technologies that are taking front pages today, 5G, artificial intelligence, and so on, would not be possible without advances in computing infrastructure, computing power, storage, memory, network, plentiful bandwidth, and so on. This is really the foundation of everything. If you look at how this has developed, machine learning, for instance, is 35 years old as an idea. It was prospering in the 1990s, but because there wasn't sufficient computing power, in addition to, of course, other deficiency, it didn't come to its prime time. Think about everything else. Think about cloud, think about modern networking and the idea of intelligent network, sort of looking at the ages as well as the foundation that was put forward more than 20 years ago. And now it is becoming possible with IoT, with 5G, and so on. So, in order to continue on this path, this has to be the primary investment in computing power, in battery power, in storage, in energy efficiency, in network technologies, in international standards that make all this work together. After this, the brilliant ideas that we have in a number of startups, larger companies, universities can come to fruition. We don't have time to talk about them in detail, but investing in the foundation is the most important part.
Very good. Well, we have just about expired our time here. We're right up against it. If any of the four of you have something that is urgent that you feel that we did not get out there, just let me know and we'll give you a 1-minute intervention here.
I guess I would just end with something we could all think about from the economist Joseph Schumpeter, who, by the way, was my thesis advisor's thesis advisor. So I guess he was my grand thesis advisor. And he said that the gale of creative destruction describes the process of industrial mutation that continually revolutionizes the economic structure from within, incessantly destroying the old one, incessantly creating a new one. And that is really how we have to think about, we have to change how we think about supply chain, and it will involve creative destruction.
Well, it's also a reminder to us that all of us who haven't read Schumpeter since we got out of college, which for me is longer ago than I would want to admit, have to go back and either read that or Samantha's thesis. Those are the only two choices. I want to thank you all for a really great conversation in which I think, I know I learned a lot, and we really got a chance to go illuminate all of this. And remind everybody that we have, I think, one more session left in the Aspen show today. Somebody want to tell us what that is? It's John Demers, the Assistant Attorney General for National Security, the Justice Department, and Bill Evanina, the Director of National Counterintelligence and Security, and Iruna Viswahana will be doing the moderation for that. So I turn things over for all of that, and I thank all of you for joining with us.
That was great. Thanks again for joining us for the 5th annual Aspen Cyber Summit. I'm John Carlin, the chair of Aspen Digital Cybersecurity Program, and the full summit agenda and bios of all our speakers are available at aspencybersummit.org. I want to thank FireEye, Intel, and Proofpoint for making this week's summit possible and helping us convene these conversations in such a complicated year. We'd also like to acknowledge Blue Vector, SICPA NA, and the American Gas Association for their additional support. I'm pleased to introduce the final session for today. We'll be back tomorrow at noon Eastern Standard Time to hear from two of the nation's top healthcare chief information security officers to talk about the security of the COVID-19 vaccine development and distribution process, a conversation I know we're all eager to hear in hopes that someday we can escape our living rooms. Now to close today, a great conversation among two colleagues, my successor at the Justice Department, the Assistant Attorney General for National Security, John Demers, and the first ever Senate confirmed director of the National Counterintelligence and Security Center, Bill Evanina. It'll be moderated by Wall Street Journal's Aruna Vishwanatha, and I hope to hear about their views on what the current threat is from China, and how many individuals do they think are inside the United States that might be collecting intelligence. And with that, turn it over to Aruna.
Hi, thanks for being with us today. I think, and we're being joined shortly by John Demers and Bill Evanina, who should be on in a minute.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here.
Great, and I think John is just about to join us.
Yes. Can you hear me, Aruna?
Yes.
Great.
I think we can't see you.
This host that stopped the video. There's Aruna. Can you see me now, Aruna?
Yes. Okay, great.
Excellent.
So thanks for joining us today. And just to kick things off, so the Justice Department had announced this China initiative just about 2 years ago. And that same week, the Justice Department did file a couple of cases alleging trade secrets theft by a couple of Chinese companies and individuals, including a Chinese intelligence officer. And then at that time, John, you said that the cases taken together paint a, quote, grim picture of a country bent on stealing its way up the ladder of economic development and doing so at American expense. And now that, it's been 2 years, there's obviously been a series of additional cases from the Justice Department. The FBI is opening a counterintelligence case every 10 hours or so linking to China. So maybe let's start off by stepping back a little bit and getting your assessment of what has all of this law enforcement activity, what kind of impact has that had? Has that picture you painted 2 years ago changed at all?
Well, thanks very much, Aruna, and obviously thanks to all the folks at Aspen Cyber. I heard Carlin's voice before as well for having me on, for having Bill on, which is the harder pull. But I think, from our perspective, what we have in the past 2-3 years managed to disrupt a significant amount of malign Chinese activity. And I can come back to that. I think we've also managed to raise awareness through our cases in the private sector, in the public, in the university community, all of which goes to helping us disrupt that activity because we really can't do it without their cooperation and their efforts and their stepping forward to help us. And then third, I think it's allowed us to further our cooperation with our international partners and other free market liberal democracies around the world. And I think we're going to need that as we work together to try to figure out what the new relationship should be with China. On the first point, on the disruption point, we talk a lot about our cases, and obviously each one of those cases represent economic espionage, political espionage, or other malign activity that has been disrupted, in that instance, oftentimes with the arrest of the individuals involved, and then later their convictions or their guilty pleas. But I think, what we've also done recently is taking a more programmatic approach. And so if you look at the cases, just as an example, over this past summer, we arrested 5 or 6 researchers who were here from China on visas, who were affiliated with the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese military, but who hadn't disclosed that affiliation, had hidden that affiliation when they applied for their visas. Those 5 or 6 arrests were just the tip of the iceberg. And honestly, the size of the iceberg is one that I don't know that we or other folks realized how large it was when we began down that road. But between those 5 and 6 arrests, between the dozens of interviews that the Bureau did of other individuals who were here in similar circumstances, and then ultimately the closure of the Houston consulate to disrupt both foreign influence activity and economic espionage activity, more than 1,000 PLA-affiliated Chinese researchers left the country. So our prosecutions were just the beginning of that, but they allowed us to message to the Chinese government that if you're going to send individuals here, you've got to do so honestly, and you can't do so hiding their affiliation to the PLA and to Chinese military universities. So that's an example of the disruption, in addition, as I said, to the cases themselves where we've arrested the people and stopped that conduct. But there are other examples of where what we're trying to do in the cases is not just arrest that individual, but disrupt a broader course of activity.
That's I think a new number that I don't think you've put that out there before, that 1,000 military researchers have left the country since those cases.
That is the new number. Yes.
Do you view that network as obviously some of those defendants describe them as sort of administrative crimes. They're not actually being charged with espionage. Do you view them as sort of a network that is involved in collaborating to collect information, or is this more of a sort of process issue where we just need to have a better handle on who is coming into the country?
Well, it's certainly the latter. I mean, we definitely need to have a better handle on who's coming into the country, but there's no question that they were part of a Chinese government effort to send these individuals here and to send them here without disclosing their identities. I mean, what we saw in the reaction to the arrests, based on other investigative work that we did, was that the Chinese government was instructing those individuals to hide their affiliations, both upfront on their application form and then later, when they were afraid of having these folks get caught. So there's no question that, this wasn't a series of coincidences or a series of individuals who didn't understand their forms. They were part of something bigger. Again, we haven't charged them with espionage. Our goal here is to disrupt that kind of activity, and you can do that in any number of different ways, and this was one of them.
Bill, to bring you in, you've been in your job for, I think, almost 7 years now, and obviously you've witnessed this shift in the US government's approach. To what extent, what have you seen as the impact of all of these trade secret theft cases, these researcher cases? Is it sort of a game of whack-a-mole a little bit, or have you seen a fundamental change in the landscape?
That's a great question, Aruna. And again, to echo what John said, thanks for the opportunity to be here with Aspen and partnering with my friend John. I think this is a really good opportunity to be able to get this information out to the people who are in this Aspen ecosystem. I think it's really important. But to your question, I think it's multifaceted in terms of the impact. Clearly, the impact that DOJ and the FBI bring with the indictments, for me, has geopolitical impact and it has counterintelligence impact. And what I mean by that is the way the Department of Justice and John's China Initiative have really promulgated the indictments to be reading indictments, to be stories of their own. It really lends itself to US-based companies to read these as a watch out for what not to do, be aware of kind of narrative, unlike, maybe other type of indictments they might do. So if you pick any one of the cases you referenced or any other of the 3 or 4 dozen cases the last couple of years, the indictments by themselves are phenomenal reads for how the process works and what China's strategy is with going ahead and trying to obtain our trade secrets and our proprietary data and our ideas. To John's last point, of those 1,000 or so PLA students, where I'm most concerned about are the graduate level students. And let's not kid ourselves. They're all coming here at the behest of the Chinese government and intelligence services. They're going to specific universities to study specific fields or areas that are going to benefit the People's Republic of China and the Communist Party and the military. So that's the strategy. We need to be aware of that so we can continue to advise and inform heads of academia at the college university level that this is happening and somehow find a way to be constructively mitigation efforts to do that. Secondarily, what I like to do, and I've done successfully with John's indictments and the hard work of the women and men of the Department of Justice and the Bureau, I've taken those indictments overseas. And I'm fortunate to have a really cool role as head of counterintelligence for both NATO and leading the efforts in the Five Eyes to take these indictments overseas to Europe and show our counterparts what's going on here in the US so they can advise and inform their policymakers in Europe of the same techniques and tradecraft we see from China. And that's been a big win, whether it be on theft of intellectual property and trade secrets to 5G, to semiconductors, nanotechnologies. We've really come a long way the last 2 years in Europe of advising and informing our partners in Europe of the nefarious activities of China. And I think that's directly relatable to the way that DOJ now writes their indictments.
That's really interesting. Is there a specific case you would point to that's sort of opened some more doors in Europe or that they've been particularly receptive to?
Yeah, I will. And I know John has heard me brag about this before. Two of them would be the Micron case. I think is something I look at as an indictment that's worthy of already a movie in the making, and as well as the Huawei indictments and the superseding indictments. To me, and I've said this on the circuit that all the CEOs, every CEO and general counsel need to read these two indictments because this is the tried and true process, not only from a cyber capability and a penetration, but a strategic intent of the Communist Party of China, as well as the insider threat, the ability of the Communist Party of China to use a suite of tools to get what they want are really, really played out in these two particular indictments. And I believe that they are a must read for US businesses who want to participate, play, and or partner with some Chinese-based company.
So, right, so you bring up sort of corporate America and CEOs as being sort of integral to your efforts on this front. There obviously is still a pretty wide gulf between how the national security community views China and the business community views China. Just to cite a story from one of my colleagues, a couple of weeks ago, the former deputy FBI director had recently resigned from Airbnb due to concerns about just how much information that the company was sharing on their customers with Chinese authorities. And at one point when he spoke up about his concerns, according to my colleagues, a company co-founder told him, quote, "We're not here to promote American values." How important is this to you? How would you think about this sort of split between the way the US government views China and the way a lot of other people in America view China?
So I think it's really important. And I probably would not use the word split. I would probably use our continuing education of America of these pitfalls. And I don't know if there's a split or there's just not yet. We've accomplished what our goal is to be able to educate and inform CEOs and board of directors. And we've been at this for a couple of years now, and John's been part of it. I've worked in a bipartisan manner with Senator Burr, Rubio, and Senator Warner, briefing tens of thousands of CEOs and board of directors of the pitfalls, specifically with third-party data sharing agreements that China mandates you must do. Also, the American public is clearly not aware of all their data that's going free to the intelligence services of China because of business arrangements between a US business and a business out of China. Some of this, Aruna, is just education and awareness of the CEOs and the general counsels of the potential pitfalls. The case you bring up of that company, Airbnb, I think is a great example. And I think we have to have a conversation with ourselves as a society when we sign up for these companies and these programs and these apps. Are we okay with our data going over to a communist country for utilization by the intelligence services? And do we even know that? And I think that's the conversation we're not there having yet, but we're trying on a daily basis. So I wouldn't say it's a split. I would say it's yet we're still in the process of educating and informing.
So John, to talk again about the broader China initiative, it seems like some of the actions the Justice Department has taken under this umbrella have been some of the things that most irritated Beijing over the past couple of years. You have the arrest of Huawei's CFO in Canada 2 years ago. You have the arrests of the military affiliated researchers. Do you see the Justice Department playing, has there been a shift in the role the Justice Department plays in foreign policy over the past couple of years? What role do you see the department playing? And is it sort of specific to China, or is there a more fundamental shift at play?
I don't know that there's a shift. I mean, fundamentally, our cases are the results of law enforcement actions and criminal investigations, like any of the cases at the department are. That said, of course, we have to recognize that sometimes our cases have foreign policy implications, either just out of necessity or because of another country will perceive it to have some kind of impact on the relationship between the U.S. and that country. So we're aware of those implications for sure when we bring these cases, but really we're just starting from the point of view of where are we seeing illegal activity, and that really is how the China initiative got started, and just being briefed day in and day out on the intelligence side on what the Chinese were doing in the United States. And then, well, what tools do we have that we can bring to bear to combat that kind of activity? But ultimately, these are law enforcement investigations. So, they don't have a foreign policy purpose, even if they have, I think, they can certainly have and have had foreign policy implications. And that's something that, we need to coordinate within the government with our interagency partners, including especially the State Department.
And do you think we should expect to see any more developments this month and next month? Or at this point, are things kind of quieting down?
No, I think you'll continue to. I mean, we march forward. The malign activity marches forward, and we're not going to pause for a few months. And I don't think the incoming folks would want us to pause for a few months. The cases, there are cases that I think will come to a charging state naturally over the course of, the next 6 or 8 weeks, and we'll move forward on those matters. And there are other investigations that are getting started that other folks will finish off. I mean, when I started this job, the cases I was bringing were ones that had started, by John Carlin and Lisa Monaco and others. And, when I leave, I think the cases that they bring are the ones that are started now.
You mentioned the election, so maybe let's talk a little bit about that. Now that the dust has settled a little bit, Bill, if you can you talk a bit about what you view as how effective the U.S. was in deterring foreign interference this time around? It seems like it's been pretty quiet. I think we even heard yesterday at this conference that we were pretty successful on that front.
Yeah, sure. I'd actually be proud to talk about that, Arun. I think from my perspective, what we accomplished the past 2 years, but specifically the last 6 to 9 months, as an integrated, holistic government effort in partnership with social media and tech firms is unprecedented. And I think it's really going to be the model of the future moving forward, how we protect not only just elections, but how we mitigate malign foreign influence and how we drive continued protection of democracy. I think our adversaries saw some significant loopholes in our democracy, and they kind of use our First Amendment and other amendments against us. So I think what we did the last 6 months to 9 months, both offensively and defensively, is going to be the playbook for which we defend in the future. I've been in this business a long time, going back prior to 9/11, and I saw this type of organizational symbiotic effort after 9/11. This is the first time I've seen it again, where we had, double-digit agencies working together every day, all day, dedicated women and men around the globe, collecting intelligence, driving action, providing real-time information to DHS and FBI, FBI and DHS taking the appropriate action, dealing with social media companies, taking stuff down, and then at the same time, doing really critical offensive measures around the globe, I think was outstanding. I'm really proud. I've said publicly, I think this would be the most important role I've had in my career. And I'm really proud of where we are right now and the success we've had. We did some really daring things the last couple months, both publicly and non-publicly. And I think they've all paid off.
Anything that you can tell us a little bit more about that have not been public yet?
I think it'll come public, but I also, my answer to you would be, I really want to give credit to the women and men of NSA, Cybercom, and CIA for the work around the globe.
So we did see one of the top officials involved in this effort, Chris Krebs, fired a couple of weeks ago. We did see the president's lawyer call for him to possibly be shot. Are you concerned that there are a lot of Americans that believe inaccurate conspiracy theories about what happened in this election?
Concern would be a word. I mean, embarrassed would be a second word. I think it's wholly inappropriate and just disappointing to me as an American, the comments that were made that you referenced. I just, as a 32-year government official, it's just embarrassing to me that you would have someone who was respected once as a U.S. attorney or a judge make those foolish comments. It's embarrassing would be the right word. As my concern, yeah, because I think, our elections, as I've said this publicly, are the core fundamental basis for which we have the ability to live in amazing democracy. We have to preserve and protect our elections at all costs. So the folks who do that, who put their lives on the line every day, metaphorically on their line, should have the ability to do that with safety and security, not be anguished because one party lost, one party won.
And it does seem like China policy is one of the few areas of overlap between the Trump administration and the incoming Biden team. Just to quote what incoming National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan had said on a podcast back in 2018, I would say there are certain areas where we should pause and say, is Trump onto something? He is much more willing to push hard in the way that the Chinese and the Russians both push hard on friends and foes alike to try to get a good outcome. I think that's a sensibility the next commander-in-chief should take up, combined with enlightened self-interest and an actual systematic decision-making process. John, what do you think changes after January 20th in the US-China relationship?
Well, I mean, I think from the department's perspective, probably not very much. As I said, ultimately, the department is looking at these matters as law enforcement matters, as individuals who've broken US laws. And, very clearly, I understood what I was doing to be building on work that had been done by my predecessors in the prior administration. Specifically, the cyber indictment back in 2014 of the PLA officers, which required working through to your prior questions, a lot of foreign policy issues related to that indictment, but they brought it over the finish line, and I think that set a precedent that we were able to build on. So I suspect, from our perspective, that work will continue. I think the big question, if I were either staying here or coming here with the new folks, is, what will the other agencies, what's their reaction going to be? My guess is whoever sits in my job, whoever sits in the AG's job is going to be pressing along the way that we have. But what has really enabled our success is we didn't get any pushback from the State Department. We didn't get pushback from Commerce. We didn't get pushback from USTR. In fact, we got, I think applause for what we were doing. So what will the folks of those agencies that have traditionally in both administrations tended to be more on the economic side of things and wanted to promote sort of the economic relationships between the countries, what will their take be? And there, I just don't have the insight into, who the folks will be and what their views are. But that's the big question that I'd be asking myself right now.
Hey, Runa, can I amplify John's answer there? Because I think he's onto something. And I think, as we work with our transition team here, and then I think two things will predicate where they go in a continuance of these efforts. Because, I would say the administration has done, I wouldn't give so much credit to the president here as much as one would want, but the administration's movement, as John talked about, that coalition of the willing in the administration of the agencies, but the evidence and the intelligence are going to matter. So the more, the evidence and intelligence we are deriving from Chinese intelligence services and Xi Jinping and their strategic intent and capability, that's not going away. So the fact that new administration comes in, they're going to now see that intelligence. President-elect Biden and Kamala Harris right now and the entire team are seeing the PDB. They're seeing that intelligence real time right now. So it's going to be an effort for them to continue down a path. May not be the exact similar path, but it's going to be really, really, really important for them to see this intelligence, this information. And to John's last point, those investigations that are being brought up and John is prosecuting, as the circle of life continues, more and more of those investigations are coming from businesses and academia to DOJ's way and FBI's way. That will continue in the new administration. And I think the new administration will be left with the ability to find a strategy or policy to continue to deal with this intelligence derivative and investigations.
Bill, have you seen any changes in behavior from China since the election, or are there sort of newer emerging issues that you think you didn't have to address as much that the new administration will have to?
Yeah, great question. So I think the last few months, parallel to the elections, we've been dealing really heavy on the COVID-19 front and China's efforts to thwart that, not only in the vaccine, but also in the promulgation of a supply chain and a movement of the vaccine all the way to inoculation. But we've also seen an uptick, which was planned, and we predicted that China would now revector their influence campaigns to the new administration. And when I say that, that malign foreign influence, that diplomatic influence plus or on steroids, we're starting to see that now play across the country to not only the folks that are in the new administration, but those who are around those folks in the new administration. So that's one area we're going to be very keen on, making sure the new administration understands that influence, what it looks like, what it tastes like, what it feels like when you see it.
And you saw more of that happening post-election?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. John, are there newer things that are on your radar now that you didn't see over the past couple of years that you think the next administration is going to have to deal with more?
I mean, I think it's a continuation of a lot of the same behavior. I mean, as Bill said, the intelligence is not going to change. The bureau is doing their work. They're unearthing a lot of this activity. They're going to bring those cases to the department. I think that's going to continue forward. I think, where we really need to stay vigilant on is on the foreign influence piece, and that's, election interference is a aspect of foreign influence that comes up every 2 or 4 years. And as Bill said, actually, the administration did a very nice job over the last years working together to deal with election interference. But the work on foreign influence continues. And on the broader issue of foreign influence, I think only the Chinese have the resources and the abilities and the will to do the breadth of foreign influence that we've seen here. And I don't think that that's been as exposed publicly as it probably will be over the coming years. Obviously, the Houston closure was a piece of trying to address that. But in terms of bringing cases and highlighting that, I think that'll be a fertile area. And to that, I mean, it's only the Chinese who we see operating not just at the national level, but understand our system well enough to operate at the state level through the state and local politicians as well. And they have the resources to be able to do that and the sophistication to do that. So I think that's going to be a big and a continued challenge. And I think our eyes were opened in 2016, but as our eyes were open, more and more of this activity from a variety of countries came into focus. And what we saw with Iran, for instance, on the election side is some of these countries learning, unfortunately, from the misbehavior of others and trying to emulate it, even if not terribly well in that case. So I think that's going to be a continued issue. And on the China side, maybe a development of where this work has gone.
In terms of more foreign influence type cases, are you suggesting we might see more Foreign Agents Registration Act cases, or you're talking more broadly than something like that?
I mean, FARA is one of the tools. We also use 951, which is an aspect of the criminal code, which is also acting as an agent of foreign power here in the US. We've used that several times, both on the Chinese side and on the Russian side over the last few years. So using a variety of those tools, and then there's also the election finance and the campaign finance cases, which fall more in the criminal division, but we see that as an aspect of sort of, illegal foreign financing cases that can also be an aspect of foreign influence. So I think across the gamut of the cases, the tools that we have to address that kind of activity, you'll see more of that kind of those kinds of cases.
Got it. So both of you had brought up the international cooperation piece of this as being important. And it seems like the Trump administration has had some success in convincing other countries to not use Huawei gear in their telecom infrastructure. Looking out over the next year, 2-3 years, maybe Bill, this question is for you. What do you see the world sort of dividing up more into a section of the world that does use Chinese technology and telecom infrastructure, and a section of the world that relies on Western technology, or do you see this shaking out in some other way?
A great question. I think both of those. I mean, I look at this both geopolitically and economically. So there are going to be parts of the world and the globe where they can only go to China and Huawei because they're at 30 cents on the dollar, right? So we've seen China now pivot to South America and deep parts of South America because there's a prime market there. I think China now has realized that we've called them out, and there is now literally a geopolitical battle space with telecommunications and hardware and Huawei that they're battling. And they thought for sure they owned Europe. That's not the case anymore because of the collaborative cooperation at multiple parts of our government with multiple parts of European governments. And I think with the pushback with the EU, which we never thought we would see, has now occurred. So I think now what's the new battle space? Africa, South America, Indonesia, you're going to see China trying to continue to build that network where they have, called depth diplomacy, where they offer people critical infrastructure, AKA Huawei, for free with like a 99-year lease with, they're basically unable to pay it. I think you're starting to see more of that, and maybe an acquiescence where they'll play in the backyard fights in Europe, in parts of maybe Western Europe, Eastern Europe, where there's some fringe areas. But I think that geopolitical battle space will continue. I think the race will be, and you've heard this, is what's going to eventually be the United States' answer to Huawei. The quicker we get to a solution of a US-based answer, the quicker we're going to have more quivers in our arrows in our quiver to be able to fight back on what our answer is there. I think, but geopolitically, I have to give credit to all of us, not only in the U.S. government, international community, and U.S. business, to push back a little bit. And we're starting to see now a change in China's behavior on Huawei. And that also incorporates some of the indictments that DOJ and John have done, because it's all in the same bucket of information, intelligence, and facts, which really changes the behavior of the Communist Party of China.
John, do you have anything you want to add on that?
Well, it's going to be very difficult. It's, telecommunications is sort of the key. And obviously during these times of everybody working from home has become even more so the way we run our lives, which is why we focused on Huawei and on 5G technologies. I do think that we were able to change the conversation with Europe over time based on the evidence that we were able to show them. I also think that the Chinese changed the conversation by their actions in Hong Kong, by their actions with respect to the Uyghurs, by their now perhaps, whatever they're thinking of doing with respect to China. And so there's been a backlash on, and also really the way that the Chinese overplayed their hand with respect to COVID assistance. And I think there was a backlash in Europe and a realization, and this is, I think, going to define the relationship with China going forward, the realization that those of us in liberal democracies, in free market economies, just don't share the same values at the end of the day with the Chinese Communist Party, and that those differences in values have consequences for the people who live in those different countries. And I think the big challenge of the future in dealing with that difference in values will be China's economic power and China's willingness to use that economic power in order to push its policy interests. So when it comes to Huawei, the big challenge in some of these developing countries, but even in developed countries in Europe, is not, oh, Huawei is 50% cheaper than the alternative. not only might Huawei be 50% cheaper because of the government subsidies in China, but the Chinese government will change the level of foreign direct investment into your country. The Chinese government will change your company's access to the Chinese market based on your decisions to choose Huawei or not choose Huawei. And we've seen that happen in Europe, and we've seen it happen in other countries around the world. And that makes it very difficult for those countries to stand up despite the security risks that they're aware of. But despite that, I think, you know, we've made significant progress, and I'm sure that the new folks will continue to push that.
So some of the Trump administration's other efforts to sort of counter Chinese technology have not been as successful. I'm thinking in particular of the TikTok ban that was not upheld in the courts, which said that the US government might have exceeded its authority on that front. At this point, it might be in TikTok's interest to wait for the Biden administration. But John, do you think that the Oracle deal will end up being completed under this administration, or what would your advice be to the next one on how to deal with TikTok?
So I think, you know, TikTok and Chinese apps are really an interesting problem for us. I think, I mean, I shouldn't comment specifically. I mean, there is that litigation's ongoing, and then there's still CFIUS reviews that are ongoing and efforts to move that forward. So I'm not going to comment specifically on what the solution space might be here. But the problem, what we know from our cases, again, and from the intelligence, is that Chinese have a huge appetite for people's personal data. And they satisfy that appetite through acquisitions, they satisfy it through thefts. If you think about Equifax, if you think about Anthem, if you think about the OPM hack. And then now they're able to satisfy it by people voluntarily giving their data to a app that is based in China. And it's really never about the app, and it's really never about the company in China. The fact is, if you do business there, you have to abide by what the government is going to ask you to do. So you might be in good faith acting as a Chinese businessman or a Chinese businesswoman, but that's really not what we're questioning. What we're questioning is your ability to act independently of the government and keep distance from the government. So I think one of the big challenges now, and the litigation has highlighted it, is how does the government deal from a national security perspective with apps and other instances where Americans and others are voluntarily turning over their data to China, and how do we protect those Americans from the exploitation of their data? I don't know that we've come to a clear answer on that, and I think that litigation and the various negotiations and the back and forth are reflecting that we still have work to do on that front, and that, you know, I think is something we're leaving for the next folks to work on. We wouldn't want them to be bored.
Of course. I know we are almost out of time, and before we ended, I did want to ask you about some of the criticism of the China initiative you have gotten from academics and others in the university research community that view this as a little bit of a racial profiling exercise, and sort of a lot of these are administrative or process crimes. I know that you've said all along the way that the Justice Department and the US government is focused on the actions of the Chinese government and not in Chinese individuals, and that some of the defendants have been not of Chinese descent. But in hindsight, are there things that you wish you had done differently about this? What about even just naming it the China Initiative? Are there things you would have wanted to do to kind of address this criticism?
I mean, honestly, I don't think so. I mean, we knew that this was a concern, and we're very careful about the way we talk about this problem, because, you know, we don't want it to become about the Chinese people. We certainly don't want it to become about Chinese Americans here in the US. And as you know, if you look through our defendants, you'll see a great mix of defendants when it comes to ethnic backgrounds. We are very much focused on behavior. And when we talk to companies, I know Bill does the same, when you talk to companies, we talk about focusing on behavior and never on using ethnicity as a risk factor or something that those companies should be looking at. Same thing on the university front. Now, on the university front, I think the main criticism has been centered on the cases involving academics, really American academics, who didn't disclose foreign sources of funding on their US grant applications. And in some cases actively hid the fact that they were also working for the Chinese government or for institutions in China, and often getting funding for the same research that they were applying for funding for from the American government. I mean, to that, and yes, so the charges have been making false statements to the US government and grant fraud. Are those administrative violations? I don't know. I mean, those go to the core of integrity at an academic institution. And an academic institution is all about disclosing sources of funding so that people who are reading your research can figure out how to read that research. And that's true regardless whether your funding is coming from the alcohol and beverage industry or whether your funding is coming from the Chinese government. The focus is on disclosure. And our cases there, I think, reflect a desire to tailor our approach to the values of those institutions, which are transparency and academic integrity. And those professors who haven't disclosed the sources of their funding when they've been applying for grants have violated what are really, university and academic values as much as US laws. So I think now there's a much greater awareness in the academic community of the importance of honest disclosures, but they knew that at the time. But also at the university level of having compliance programs that are adequately tailored to ensuring that your professors and you as a university are not making false representations to the US government. And our point here is, once you make those disclosures, let the US funding agencies, let your university decide what they're comfortable with you taking money or not. But if you don't disclose it, they can't decide that. And that's what we saw in case after case. And honestly, it's why the universities have been cooperative with us in case after case, because they know that they can't make that assessment if their professors and researchers aren't being honest with them.
I think we're just about out of time, but do either of you have closing thoughts you want to leave the audience with? Maybe Bill, we'll start with you.
Well, first of all, again, Maria, thanks for the opportunity to be here with John, and thanks to Aspen for allowing us the opportunity to be here together to talk about what John and I both believe are, I think, and I believe for sure, China is the existential threat that we face as a nation. John hit it on the head with their values are completely different than ours. And I think they continue to use theft by any means as part of the business process for the Communist Party of China. And we need to find a way to mitigate that, either through continued prosecutions and maybe more diplomacy, but we have to have an answer to it. That we're looking at $500 billion a year in lost economic investment, proprietary data, trade secrets, just the Communist Party of China. That's a lot of money. And I think we have to figure out how do we stem that tide. And also to John's point, we have to continue and have an enduring conversation with academia, research and development about this effort and those prosecutions, as you call them, administrative. They're being charged with non-compliance of administrative things. But the tail of that is, while they were doing that, there's a shadow lab somewhere in China that's building that same technology and selling on the global market for 30 cents on the dollar. So there is a long tail, both economically and geopolitically. So I think we have, as a country, have to have a more of a whole society approach to this effort and be more aggressive in advising and informing what is the consequence if we don't continue to have some equilibrium on the global stage.
And John, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Great. Well, thanks again, Aruna. Thanks, Bill, and thanks to all of you who are on the line and listening. I think, by the way, Bill, I think we've lost participants over the course of this. Is a very bad sign for you and me. But but look, for the participants, really, a lot of whom are from the private sector, as Bill and I have said in many occasions, we can't do this by ourselves. And really, ultimately, as a government, we're trying to help the private sectors and universities to play defense, to defend against these threats, to educate about these threats, so that they can continue to play offense, so that they can innovate. And what gives me hope in all of this is that technology is ultimately constantly innovating. And I do think, and I think the coronavirus vaccine is a great example of what can happen when American companies and other companies can put their minds to it. They can innovate very fast with government help in this case, but with the great focus that's been brought upon us by this tragedy. But that's the way we're going to get through this. So our job is to make the Chinese job harder, to slow them down, to cause them to force more resources. Our job is to educate, but ultimately all of that is with the goal that American companies in the private sector can continue to innovate as they help us play defense. So I hope that's a lot of what we've been working with the private sector on over the last several years, and I trust that will continue on in the future. And I'll be eagerly reading about all these issues, because I think once you get into this space and you realize how important it is, it's very hard for you to just forget about it and move on. So I look forward to reading your articles, Aruna.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us today, and thanks to everyone watching in the audience. And I think that ends this session, and we'll see everyone tomorrow.